The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 281, The Return of Tiffany. It was like a sudden festival at the inn, and everyone was suddenly enjoying the festivities. Many people were watching from the comfort of their rooms, but many had come out into public spaces to enjoy the atmosphere. There were two topics that were being discussed most commonly. First, who was crazy enough to attack the inn? Even though there was an invasion a short while ago as well, no guests were hurt, which showed just how in control the inn was of everything. Second, the topic was who would be the winner for the 50,000 MP prize? The contestants' names were shared, and if the contestant permitted, some information about their cultivation and ability. The crowd favorites were Rourke Morrison, for naturally he had a stellar reputation on Earth, a well-respected captain from the Jotun army, here on vacation from the Vega system, and finally a young devil. But the bets were not only one who would win, but on how many points any of the participants could get. Considering the limited number of enemies, no one was expected to have an overwhelming lead, but there were still a few who were expected to get at least 10 points. While the crowd was hyping themselves up, the inn staff was preparing for the event. Mary was spreading the delinquent vines underneath the battleground, and Gawain was requested to help out as well. He would only interfere if a participant was about to die, and would remove them from the formation. This technically wasn't a part of his job, but the inn staff was all so friendly, a stark difference from the humans he had met early when he gained sentience, that he had become fast friends with many of them, and so did not mind helping out. In the meantime, some of the staff who were free stood in awe. For example, Z, who had been slightly traumatized from how badly he was wounded, could not help but compare how they had handled the situation, versus the innkeeper's arrangements. This invading force, despite being fewer in number, was much stronger since most of their forces were in the Golden Core realm, with quite a few nascents as well. Despite that, not only had they been easily herded into the formation, but the innkeeper, instead of getting angry at the invaders, actually used them to entertain his guests. He was so vastly different from Z's direct boss, Leo, the original caretaker of the gamer's den. Z could not remember the last time he saw Leo, and of all the inn's staff and workers, he was the most absent. His sheer laziness and lack of effort was all the more apparent in front of the innkeeper's silent dedication towards the inn. Velma had a day off and was, surprisingly, sitting alongside Larry. If Lex noticed him, he would be tremendously surprised to discover that Larry was in the Golden Core realm. His cultivation was more focused on absorbing various rare metals into his body than anything else, and the inn had been a good source for that. During all his time here, his many attempts at wooing one of the waitresses had failed miserably, but he had developed a decent friendship with Velma out of it. She especially loved hearing stories of his failed exploits back on Earth and often encouraged him to keep on trying. In fact, she even set Larry up with a Nico, cat-human, from X-142 and, well, it wasn't a complete failure yet. "Are you placing any bets?" Velma asked as she looked at the screen. "I don't have the MP to spare. I'm a wanted man, back on my planet, so it's hard to come by any money. What about you? Place any bets?" Of course I did, and not just a small bet. "I placed all my savings on a single participant," she said with a sly smirk. "If you beg me, maybe I'll share with you what I know." "Oh? In that case, O noble miss of the inn, I implore you to impart onto me some information. I could really use some MP. You know, if I go back to my planet, my life will be in danger." "Che, fool someone else. I know you've been hiding in King Marlowe's new mansion, disguised as a gardener. Who has the guts to do anything to you there?" "How did you know?" Larry asked, genuinely startled, only to be responded with a knowing smile. "Well, anyway, since you asked so nicely, I'll tell you. The winner is going to be a human from Nibiru. She's extremely powerful, extremely ruthless, and she benefited greatly from the upgrade Nibiru is undergoing in its star level. She's been hiding at the inn lately, because she's caused a lot of problems back on Nibiru, but if she wins this 50,000 MP, it'll be tremendously helpful to her, so she won't let anyone else get it. Her name is Tiffany." Having full faith in Velma, Larry bet quite a decent amount on her. Countless conversations similar to that one were taking place, but little Tiffany from Nibiru remained overlooked in almost all the bets, since no one knew her. Eventually, the time ran out as 30 minutes was just a short interval, and the event was finally beginning. Mary instructed all the participants to make their way to the battleground while she explained the rules once again. Killing an enemy got them 1 point, but capturing an enemy got them 2 points. This wasn't really a fair event, considering the higher-leveled cultivators had a blatant advantage, but as an impromptu event held in the absence of the Innkeeper, it could not be perfect. Another rule was stated right before the contestants went in, which is that anyone who attacked a fellow contestant would get disqualified. With that, the event began and all the contestants walked through the white wall of the formation, appearing at the far end from where the invaders were. Nzar immediately noticed their entry, and immediately picked up on the fact that they were exactly the same number of enemies as him and his crew. Many thoughts ran through his mind, but his orders to his crew were ruthless and efficient, as usual. There was no build-up to the fight as it immediately began. It was absolute chaos, and in the very first second, Kawain separated several participants who were going to die under nascent-level attacks. These participants were, naturally, disqualified. On Zar's end, however, they had no immortal to protect them, so immediately there were some deaths. The nascent cultivators took to the skies, fighting in midair. The pillagers and participants both wanted to avoid friendly fire, for their own reasons, which formed an unspoken understanding. On the ground, however, it was absolute chaos. No one had even tried to capture an enemy instead of killing, for the battle was too dangerous to take any risks. The numbers dropped quickly and in just the first few minutes, it went from 101 pillagers to mid-60s while the participants actually dropped to the 40s. The pillagers fought for a living, while the participants were just the lucky ones who managed to enter the tournament first. It was fortunate that Kawain was able to save all of them with great skill, removing them without harming them or their enemies. But, after the first massive drop in numbers, the fight stabilized as the remaining few were similar in strength and skill. It was here that the strength of the pillagers became evident, for not only were they skilled in fights, but they had incredible cooperation as well. The participants, on the other hand, were just fighting randomly. Even when they paired up, they could not match the synergy of the enemies. But, while they were the ones under pressure, the remaining participants were elites in their own rights. It was now that a few names started to stand out on the leaderboard. A surprise to everyone, except 2 specific people, was that on the top of the leaderboard was the name Tiffany. She already had 20 points. This wasn't because she had killed 20 people, but that she incapacitated every foe effortlessly, at which point a vine would emerge from the ground and take the captured enemy away. When Tiffany struck a foe, it was no longer a matter of skill. Her ability was so astounding that even the viewers could not accurately understand what happened, despite the effect being quite simple. If she attacked a pillager with a punch, and the pillager blocked her punch, without moving anywhere, the pillager would be struck by a sonic boom before fainting. If a pillager managed to dodge her punch, however, still sonic boom. If a pillager saw that she had the intention to attack, and ran away, sonic boom. If a pillager thought about attacking her, he would suffer a sonic boom. One pillager, in fact, only gave her a dirty look before suffering a sonic boom. The most common wound her victims suffered was ruptured eardrums if they had those. She was a force of nature, an unstoppable entity with a relentless will. She was the living embodiment of the drumming in a good rock song, because wherever anyone heard her strike, they would get chills. Chapter 282. Don't forget the aesthetics. Lex was not observing the event too closely, and was more focused on monitoring its success overall. It was for that reason that he did not recognize Tiffany, not to mention that she looked vastly different from when he last saw her. The guests, however, could not take their eyes off her. She was ruthless, not in the sense that she was defeating every enemy she came across. Her staggering performance was throwing off all the bets people had placed. Some noticed that there was more to her attacks than the simple sonic booms, but even if they could discover the secret, it would not help them remedy the situation. It was fortunate then that the battle entered a balanced phase. The pillagers' coordination was keeping them from suffering any more losses, while the participants' extreme powers and skills saved them. Whichever side gave in first would suffer tremendously. In the air, the battle was a lot more hectic. Nzar was proving his worth and fighting 3 nascent participants on his own, and seemed to be winning. Furthermore, he was better equipped than the participants for the fight, which gave him an edge in both offense and defense. The various pillagers under him also seemed to be more skilled than the participants, and even Rorik found himself suppressed, something he hadn't encountered in a long time. "Mary, I'm busy over here, so I'll check back in later," said Lex, once he was satisfied with how the event was progressing. "Don't hesitate to call me if any issues arise, but if there aren't any problems, then just wait for me to get done to give me the report." Lex turned his attention back to the issue of deciding on his techniques. He could have continued to focus on the inn, it would have taken at most a few more hours, but Lex was pressed for time. Not only did he have to go through this massive list and decide on his techniques, he had to practice them as well. If he had access to a meditation room from the inn, it would be no problem learning them, but as things were, he didn't know how long it would take. In a few days, when his classes started, he would be even more strapped for time, which is why he had to make the most of every moment. His first priority was evasion and escape. Evasion could fall under movement-type techniques, but escape covered a vast array of technique types. This would help him escape from any enemies who were too strong for him, or escape in a situation where he gets trapped the way that Drek had. The options were truly diverse, and it was at this point that techniques with spiritual affinities started to come into play. Wind, lightning, and ice were some of the more common affinities seen in movement techniques, but the most incredible and effective ones seemed to be from space affinity. Lex did not have any affinities, as far as he knew, but he tried out the simplest movement technique with a wind affinity to see if he could use the technique. He could not. Visit mybo.x-novel.com to read, please. It would require more research to understand why this was so, but for now, he accepted that fact and moved on. For clarification, while he could not use any techniques that required his spiritual energy to have an affinity, a neutral technique that took advantage of an element in nature was an entirely different concept. An example was the defensive technique he used that absorbed cold energy. It did not require Lex to have an icy affinity at all. In the end, Lex decided on 2 movement techniques. The first, Heart's Marathon, was similar to his previous movement technique Falcon Relief in the sense that it boosted his overall speed in every sense. This would not only help in escaping, it was great for evasion, blocking, attacking, and everything else that required any form of movement. It had a fixed cost in terms of spiritual energy, meaning it would use up Lex's energy at a constant rate while he was using the technique. The second technique, Home Sweet Home, was used for a linear burst that would increase Lex's speed tremendously. Its most obvious use was for escape, or to gain a lead during a chase, but Lex could imagine himself using it to close in on an enemy as well. Its peculiar name was due to the technique's creator's deep wish to run back home any time he left his house. The escape techniques, which were next, gave Lex a migraine. They seemed to be as useless as they were diverse, and all the good ones seemed to require an affinity. Or they had extreme requirements which were difficult to fulfill. In the end, Lex picked one called the in-law effect that Lex suspected he would be able to use due to a loophole. The requirement was stringent, and required Lex to stay in one location for up to 3 hours while he used the technique. But once the technique was done, it was supposed to let the user's soul leave the body, and move up to several miles away, depending on how much energy was used. This technique was not designed for humans, whose souls were too weak to leave their physical body at this level. However, Lex suspected that due to the nature of his body and soul, he would be able to use the technique without issue. It would require some testing to determine, but if it didn't work, Lex could always pick another one. Next, Lex planned on picking defensive techniques, offensive techniques, and some miscellaneous techniques, in that order. The reason he was picking techniques in that order was that, now that the options available to him were more versatile, he planned on using his uncanny ability to learn defensive techniques in various ways. Blocking attacks and protecting himself definitely was a priority, but why should he limit himself to just that? If, for example, he created a shield so sturdy his enemies could not break it, then could he not use that shield to trap his enemy as well? Theoretically, couldn't he create some kind of defensive barrier and then walk over it to form an impromptu bridge? To be honest, he didn't know the limits to which he could use these techniques, but he fully intended to find out. But while he could learn endless defensive techniques, it was best to focus on just a few for now. Too many techniques would make it difficult for him to choose the best one in the heat of battle, and drastically reduce his efficiency in utilizing them. S's by and oval by, n. The first one he picked was called Talk to the Hand. It allowed him to extend an invisible barrier from his hand that could extend 12 feet, 3.6 meters, in length and 8 feet, 2.4 meters, in height. The best part was, the strength, or technically defense, of the barrier was directly proportional to Lex's body's. It was unfortunate that it required Lex's hand to be up, which limited its distance and eliminated the element of surprise, but Lex was looking forward to the day he could block a barrage of long-range attacks simply by holding out his hand. His next technique was called Ripple Shell. It formed an elastic barrier around him that spread any damage received across its entire surface to reduce the effect. What Lex liked most about this was that this barrier would not stop Lex from attacking or doing anything else, and once Lex used it, it would continue to exist without being a drain on Lex's energy pool. Following that, Lex picked up a few circumstantial techniques. For example, there was one that strengthened the defensive capabilities of objects. There was another designed to protect inner organs and one in particular that required an external energy source to sustain once established. With just these few techniques, Lex already had a few plans about how he could implement them in different situations. Next up, the attack techniques. For this, Lex already had a clear-cut idea of what he wanted. He was searching for overwhelming attacks, to serve as trump cards or secret aces, to use in opportune moments. This was because Lex already knew that Regal Embrace would cause him problems when learning attacks. The solution Lex had thought of was to focus more on his technique, weapons, and arrays for attacking. He thought it would be hard to pick out such a technique, but it turned out to be the easiest. Lex was extremely satisfied with the technique's description, build-up and implementation. The technique was called evisceration, and was for what it did, it was all in the name. Finally, it was time for the miscellaneous techniques. The techniques that weren't strictly designed for battle, and could be used in multiple scenarios. Choosing these took the longest, for these were the most commonly used techniques, and would accompany Lex on a day-to-day basis. Not only would they affect his quality of life, they would affect his future as well. These included techniques to dormant formations, traps, arrays, or other techniques. It also included things such as healing and preservation techniques, cleaning techniques, air and water filtration techniques. Heck, it even contained things Lex had never even considered, such as refining the etiquette of your energy implementation and signature. In high society, where even things such as forks and knives had to be used in the proper fashion, how could it be possible for one to let their energy signature run rampantly? These aesthetic-based techniques, in fact, were the rarest of all. Some would even give your energy a pleasant scent and sensation. Much later, Lex did not even realize how much time he had spent looking through these techniques, and eventually fell asleep in the library, still scrolling through the many options. He could not help but think, in his last waking moments, how helpful some kind of smart, computerized assistant would be that could sift through all this mess and just tell him the techniques most optimal for him. Chapter 283, Lady Velma. While Lex looked through the techniques and selected them, the midnight madness eventually came to a somewhat unexpected end. Despite Tiffany's admirable start, the favorites for victory were still the nascent-level cultivators. Yet there was an unexpected turn. While all his subordinates and lieutenants were defeated, Tsar himself held up the remaining nascents by himself. This gave plenty of time for Tiffany to rack up an irrecoverable lead. In the end, literally besieged by all the participants, Tsar still managed to survive. He was defeated, not killed, though his condition wasn't the best. There was a small celebration after the event ended, and Tiffany received her 50,000 MP as well as a special token to commemorate her victory. Larry and Velma became the biggest winner from all the bets other than Lex, of course. Due to how unexpected the event went, most people lost their bets, and Lex ended up raking in a neat 210,000 MP via all the gambling, feasting and celebrations. Had Lex been paying attention to the inn at this time, he would have noticed a few interesting things happening at this point. Tiffany, along with her winnings, headed straight towards the greenhouse and waited in the forest for the sovereign galactic turtle to emerge. They talked for a bit before Tiffany pulled up her makeshift backpack and from it extracted what looked like burned-up roots. The turtle took the root from her, and the gardener appeared beside Tiffany and accepted 40,000 MP from her. It may seem like she only had 10,000 MP remaining, but she had also inherited 20,000 MP from Ijashima when he died, so she currently had 30,000 MP for herself. As for the details of the transaction that had occurred between her and the turtle, they were a secret known only to them. While this was happening, Will Bentham finally signed the deal with the governor of Vegas Minima, with Mary as the assistant innkeeper as the witness, and through the guild room conducted their first major transaction. Through the 1% charge of all transactions, Lex earned another 4 million MP. It may seem like this was a lot, but the truth was, this was only a small part of the cooperation they were planning. Will Bentham was supplying the governor with extremely rare resources they had managed to collect from their new minor realm, but did not understand how to use. In exchange, the governor was not only providing them with various new technologies, far beyond anything Earth had, but also weapons and, most importantly, the knowledge to build a sufficiently advanced space command center. After all their matters were concluded, Will went to attend another meeting in the inn, this time followed only by his very competent bodyguard, Hugo. Visit, Mybo X novel. Com, to read, please. When he arrived at the new room, it was Larry and Matilda who were waiting for him. Larry did not wear his usual cavalier smile, and in fact, had a grave look in his eyes. I was informed you have information about Hugo's family, Will said, sitting down. His bodyguard, Hugo Laurent, had only agreed to work with Will on the condition that will help him investigate what happened to his family that had been killed behind his back. Larry and Matilda provided the first real lead he had been able to find. I hope you have some evidence to back up your claims. This is not a matter I treat lightly. Neither do we, said Larry, his fists clenched tight. Actually, finding out about Hugo's family was coincidental. Let me introduce myself. I am Larry Dershaw, from the Dershaw family. Will was startled, for he recognized the name. I'm sure you've heard the stories about my family being banished to the moon. Well, sometime during the upheaval, caused by the council taking over Earth and the moon, my family disappeared. This is my associate, Matilda. Her brother was also killed by someone from the council. We were working together when. While this meeting was going on, yet another one was taking place between Sam Brown and Richard, two of the original nascents from Earth, with a devil. The details of the meeting were unsurprisingly cliché. The two, unwilling to come to terms with their lost power, were striking up a deal with the devil. Something that was surprising, however, was happening not in these meetings, but in the interrogation room near the greenhouse. All the captured pillagers were held prisoner here. To make things quite simple, and ensure that none of them caused any problems, Anita had volunteered her aid. She resurrected all the dead pillagers and had them guard these few survivors. The undead pillagers, it must be pointed out, did not have the gruesome and decaying appearance one would assume. Not only had they recovered their appearance to what it was before they died, they had undergone some sort of cleansing. Since it was Anita's angelic voice that revived these bodies, as beautiful and pure as it was, the bodies were washed from their impurities. The shackles of a cruel life were lifted from them, the karma absolved, and what they turned into was if they had been saints, living a humble life of piety. They were as pure as the day they were born. One extremely important thing to know about undead was that they did not retain their original souls, but new, extremely weak and feeble energy filled their body, replacing the function that the soul would have performed. The security measures aside, the surprising occurrence here was not Anita's help in security, but who was performing the interrogations. There was no bloodshed, no weapons, no threats or blackmail. Instead, one of Nzar's lieutenants, an alien known as Grumble that looked similar to a Doberman with small, bat-like wings on its back as well as a third eye on its forehead, was sitting nervously at a table with tea and biscuits placed in front of him. Opposite to him sat Velma, taking a small sip of her tea and then nodding, as if appreciating the taste. "Please, I'll tell you whatever you want," the Grumble pleaded, with tears welling up in its three eyes. At the same time, it nervously eyed its captured companions, but they were all unconscious. "We're pillagers, killers. We've looted all over the galaxy. Entire worlds have known our wrath." "Oh hush, why are you speaking of all these boring things?" Velma said chidingly. "I am a lady, and my friend Larry told me that ladies should not spend their time talking about violence. You know, you're not the first Grumble I've met. Some time ago, we had this lovely couple visit us on their honeymoon. Well, actually, they were going to X142 for their honeymoon, but through a twist of fate, ended up here. Oh, their love story was so wonderful, I heard it from them a million times. I remember how the wife dedicated her life to her husband, and the mark of love she left on her husband, to tie their fates together." As she said that, Velma's eyes wandered to a patch of gray fur beneath one of the Grumble's wings. "They told me that through the mark, they can always feel one another." "No, please no," the Grumble trembled once again. "Please, I'll tell you whatever you want." "You will? How lovely. Then tell me, how did you two meet?" The Grumble trembled once again, and then, reluctantly started telling Velma his own love story. He made sure to fit in all the information about Nzar he could, every opportunity he got, and gave as little information about his beloved as he could. If he didn't know any better, he really would start to feel that this wicked woman was more interested in his love life than their origins, but he was no fool. The moment he saw that evil woman raise his former comrades to life, heal them of their injuries, and then enslave their minds, he knew they had finally come across someone they should not have offended. It was fortunate that those who came back to life did not seem to have their memories, or else he suspected he would not be given a chance to be interrogated at all. Velma, on the other hand, listened to his story eagerly. Her endless curiosity, friendly attitude and love for gossiping had resulted in a unique situation that no one had yet realized. Even though she had never left the inn itself, through talking to the various guests and learning all about their lives, along with the diverse crowd that the inn had started to receive, in the entire inn she knew more about the universe than anyone else. She had become a living encyclopedia, and at the speed at which she gathered new information, soon it would be more fitting if Lex asked her questions about the universe than Mary. At least, Velma wasn't limited by the system with what she could say. As for whether she truly was only listening for love stories or actually fully interrogating the Grumble, well, only the innkeeper would find out when he eventually returned. She had prepared many reports for him about things she found interesting, reports even Mary did not know of. Chapter 284, Midnight Tavern. Once Lex woke up, he finished up his selection and returned to his apartment. There were many things he needed to practice, attacking with arrays and his new techniques among them. There was a part of Lex that wondered why he couldn't just use the techniques he already knew. After all, considering those same techniques would be powered by a stronger fuel source, they should be more powerful as well, right? That was not what happened, as even fueled with spiritual energy rather than chi, the techniques could not perform much better, for they apparently had an upper threshold. The techniques themselves were just not designed to be used on such a scale. The intricacies of that Lex would learn during one of his new classes focused on cultivation. For now though, he was catching up with what occurred at the inn. When he saw his MP balance at 6,451,000, he smiled. Once he had gotten the full update, the first thing that needed to be done was decide what to do with the prisoners. He didn't want to kill them outright, but considering their past, just kicking them out of the inn wasn't the best solution either, since then Lex would feel responsible if they harmed someone. In the end, he deferred the decision, and told Mary to make sure they wouldn't break free from their imprisonment. The second thing he needed to do, or rather, wanted to do, was something he had been thinking about for a while. Mary, now that we have decent security at the inn, and our income has increased, there's something I want to try. I want to use the increased authority that I have and open up a branch of the inn in this realm. Mary was taken aback, as this was something that had never occurred to her. But, after her initial surprise, she replied, that would be redundant. It may make sense for you to try to make another inn there, but as soon as you are able to connect this realm back to the main inn, the new branch would become redundant. Not necessarily, Lex replied confidently. This is not a spur-of-the-moment idea. I've been thinking about this for a while. The main inn will always be that one, but I want a few physical locations for the inn in a few worlds as well. These new locations won't be operating the same way as the main one, they'll be a lot more low-key. But, for certain customers, if I like them, we can give them access to our better services, such as the meditation room or recovery room. After all, being teleported away to a new location is not ideal for everyone. This way, the inn can become a part of a community and, once the realm is connected, it can even be a way we can give out golden keys. Furthermore, once we've connected this realm back to the main inn, and we have a few more physical locations, it'll be a lot easier to find capable employees we want to hire. Plus, we can develop a network of inns. We can gather information across the universe, offer the best services, make the best use of all resources. Our options are endless, we shouldn't limit ourselves by just doing the obvious. Weren't you the one who said to find ways to make use of the system's loopholes? Besides, how can the Midnight Inn be the best inn in the universe if it only has one branch? Lex's last statement was one he said as a random justification for his idea, but it was as if Lex had somehow insulted the system's honor, and immediately prompted the release of a new quest. SSN, OV, Elbin. New quest, establish a branch of the Midnight Inn, the Midnight Tavern. Pay 5% accumulated energy. Pay 10 million MP. Quest reward, pocket watch. Remarks, the Midnight Inn is the best universal hodling establishment in this universe. How can it not have branches? Lex, for once, was amused by the system's reaction while Mary was astounded by it. The truth was, she had a lot of ideas for how to develop the inn, but she held back in expressing them because she didn't want Lex to become dependent on her for ideas. Lex's unorthodox way of thinking, however, seemed to have surpassed her wildest expectations for how to develop the inn. It seemed, more and more, he was proving himself a capable innkeeper. After all, he was no longer the one chasing quests to improve the inn, but the system was giving out quests to meet his vision. Well, to be honest, this is not something I ever even expected, said Mary. I had no way of figuring out how to even approach this, but with a quest, everything will become much easier. Easier, yes. But the wording on this quest makes it look like the system will form the tavern on its own once I pay up the MP as well as the energy. This is not good. While I save up for this, you have to think of a way to let me control where and how the tavern is formed. This has to go according to what I want. I'll look into it. Lex came out of this much happier than he expected. He was completely prepared for there to be multiple problems with his idea, for he had already scoured the system interface and did not find any way to establish branches anywhere. The next thing for him to focus on now was once again on collecting energy. Fortunately, Quenhild provided him with a solution. The fact that the Academy was going to open up multiple new minor realms, completely unexplored, meant there were suddenly many areas easily within his reach where he could search for energy. He had not yet decided if he would join her group or go on his own. Once he had more information about this event, he would decide. The drawback of joining Quenhild was that she was planning on focusing on a single minor realm, instead of exploring many, while the advantage was that it would clearly be safer in a group than alone. Lex put all these thoughts aside for now and focused on practicing forming arrays. He was a little excited, for this would be his first time trying to draw one. Since he was just starting out, he chose an extremely simple and stable array. It only had a few characters, and its only effect was to provide a small degree of warmth. This was an array commonly used while traveling to heat up places like rooms, tents, beds, or even baths. He stuck out his index finger and slowly started to draw a character in the air. You did not really need to draw each character like this by finger, but considering that Lex had only just reached the Foundation realm, his control over spiritual energy was not the best, and this made it much easier. As he released the energy from his finger, it remained in the air with a silver hue. The hue was the effect of one of the aesthetic techniques Lex had picked up, since normal spirit energy would be invisible. He did this on purpose, for he needed to see if he was drawing properly and if any deviations occurred in the character. It need not be said that Lex's handwriting was not the best. Of course, that was before he started cultivating. Now he had much better control over his body, and though his handwriting had improved, drawing characters for arrays needed extreme precision. After he completed the first character, the silver hue of the spiritual energy faded, and the character took on an orangish color. This was normal, as this character represented a type of ember. After a moment, when the character did not explode or go horribly wrong in some way, Lex continued with the next one. Honestly, a part of him was expecting him to mess up somehow, but his control over his energy remained stable and each character he drew was perfect. A couple of minutes later, once the array was complete, the characters merged and a soft, yellow light emitted gentle warmth into his room. It was like putting on a cozy pair of socks, still warm from coming out of a dryer. For a moment, Lex was stunned. He actually did it on his first try? Wasn't this supposed to be a test of commitment and dedication, something that was supposed to take countless tries? Was he a natural at this? No, going as far as calling himself a natural was surely conceited. After a moment of deliberation, though, he started drawing some new characters. This time, he was not drawing a tried and tested array, but one that he had thought up on his own. Theoretically, it should work, and now he would find out. There were 9 characters in this one, so it took much longer, for he was drawing very slowly. Eventually though, when he drew the last character, and all the characters started to merge into one, his heart skipped a beat. Could it really be possible? An emotionless, electronic voice whispered in his ear, "Hello world." Lex burst into a mad laughter. This would be fun. Chapter 285 Understanding His Instincts. The process of getting acquainted with casting arrays was a tedious one. After his initial Hello World experiment, Lex no longer tried to cast any original arrays, and instead repeatedly cast the warming array he first tried. After successfully casting the array 10 times, he paused to take note of his progress. The first thing he noticed was that, for now, he was stuck being extremely slow at forming an array. If he tried to speed up writing a character even a little, the character would be disrupted and all the spiritual energy would disappear. That was only the case in this simple array. As for more complicated arrays, instead of disappearing, it may result in an adverse reaction. The second thing he noticed was that, since he was taking so long in forming an array, large changes in the ambient spiritual energy could interfere with the array, causing it to fail. This was an issue he would need to address. He also learned that if he ended up taking too long to form an array, that would also result in the array failing. Fortunately, he had already taken a beginner's class for arrays and knew how to tackle many of these problems. All it would take now was the occasional adjustment and a lot of practice. The next few days, all Lex did was practice his techniques or arrays, and met Amelia when she was free to get some rest and make sure he didn't burn out. When his classes began, he had to reduce his practice time, but while it slowed down his progress with regards to his techniques, it helped him in other areas. Especially his class, that taught him more about cultivation in general. In fact, in the very first class, Lex was able to understand why his danger instincts were so much keener than the surrounding people. Cultivation is different for different species, and they each have various barriers, the professor explained. However, we will only be focusing on human cultivation for now. Regardless of what kind of cultivation system you follow, human cultivation is divided into 3 basic categories, namely, the soul, spirit, and body. Spiritual cultivation is one of the most widespread, mainly because the resources required to follow this cultivation path are readily available. That does not, however, mean that it is stronger or weaker than the other paths. Each of them have unique benefits. For instance, it may seem like it is more difficult to defeat an enemy that cultivates the body, but that is only because most people are more used to fighting against spiritual cultivators. The truth of the matter is, the most ideal cultivation would be to cultivate all three at the same time, but that is extremely impractical because of how difficult it would be, time and resource consuming it would be, and lastly, finding three compatible techniques to cultivate at the same time borders on impossible. But, all is not lost, for even if you only cultivate a single path, as you progress across the cultivation levels, the other two will also gradually be affected. When talking about specific benefits, let's begin with spiritual cultivation. Following the spiritual cultivation path grants the cultivator a strong and precise control over spiritual energy. This control can then serve to benefit the cultivator through the use of various professions, such as weaponsmiths, array masters, formation masters, and more. Furthermore, at the golden core stage, it grants the cultivator access to spiritual sense, a sixth sense that cultivators can not only use to observe the world around them but also interact with it. It can allow you to directly communicate with others, and makes you more sensitive to the change in spiritual energy in the world around you. Another benefit, one that is often overlooked, is how cultivating the spiritual path allows you to increase the capacity of your brain. This doesn't mean it directly makes you smarter, but increases your capacity for multitasking, extrapolating better, and in general refines your thought processes. The professor didn't elaborate, but Lex got a general idea. It was like improving the processor as well as RAM in a computer. If the tasks you were performing with the computer were affected by a lack of those things, then you would suddenly notice a boost in performance. If, however, you weren't doing much to begin with, then no matter how much the computer improved, it would not affect things. Or, a simpler way of putting it was that if you were smart to begin with, then you'd suddenly be able to do a lot more. If you were dumb, however, then an improvement in cultivation would still leave you dumb, but just faster at being dumb. Lex snickered to himself before turning his attention back to the professor. The next most common form of cultivation is body cultivation. It need not be said that the body is the foundation of our life, and cultivating your body makes you more resilient and harder to kill. A common misconception is that body cultivators are focused on great physical strength, and while that is true for many of them, it is not the essence of body cultivation. Follow current novels on Ovalby in. The essence of body cultivation is preserving life. At the same time, as a secondary effect, it drastically strengthens the subconscious mind. That means not only is your brain better at taking care of the various functions of your body, you become more sensitive to the minute details of what's happening around you. For example, if there is a person in front of you who suddenly decides to attack you, your body will automatically sense the minuscule changes his body would exhibit before he attacked and warn you about it. On a conscious level, you may not notice his change in stance, tightening of the muscles, his eyes scanning you for a weak point, but your brain would, and warn you in the form of instincts or gut feeling. But it goes beyond just that. Sometimes, the threat to your life is not coming from a person, but from some external factor outside of your current view. Since the focus of body cultivators is on preserving life, sometimes body cultivators are able to detect threats or danger from far off, with no apparent indication of the danger itself. The theory behind this is studied in a more advanced class. You only need to know that this is something they can do. We now know the individual benefits of cultivating two paths, but what if you cultivate both at the same time? Would the effects stay the same or possibly be even stronger? The answer is, not only would the effects remain, the growth in the effects would increase by an exponential amount. The cultivator would already have the energy sensitivity of a spiritual cultivator, but enhanced by the strength of the body cultivator's subconscious mind, the cultivator's control would quickly enter the levels of the most capable masters, and their precision would be exemplary as well. That is not to say, someone who does not cultivate both paths cannot reach this level, but just that it would require more work. The cultivator's sensitivity towards danger would also increase, and this time, the increase is even more ridiculous. It has been reported that dual cultivators can sometimes even sense the exact moment someone decided to harm them, even if in a minor way. Furthermore, due to the granted sensitivity towards energy, the cultivator could also possibly detect dangers from nature, or natural disasters. In summary, it takes the advantages of both and multiplies it manifold. Of course, I'm sure all of you are also familiar with the difficulty of following such a path. It is absolutely not something that can be done on a whim. This finally leaves the last path, that of the soul. In a way, soul cultivators are considered both the weakest and the strongest. They are the weakest, because their distinct lack of spiritual techniques as well as a strong body make them more vulnerable. However, they are also considered the strongest, because it is incredibly difficult to defend against a soul attack. Most cultivators are completely incapable of defending their souls before the nascent realm. It's not just a matter of being unable to defend. Soul techniques are so rare that even those who want to learn to defend their souls may not be able to. Soul cultivators are also adept at various fields, such as tracking, cursing, enchanting, and the like. Furthermore, it is nearly impossible to lie or deceive a soul cultivator in the same realm. This is because, while they lack the sensitivity towards energy or danger, they can easily detect any living being's intentions from the fluctuations of their soul. When soul cultivators reach the golden core realm, they gain the ability to communicate with any living being directly through their soul, making their ability more versatile than spirit sense in this regard. Chapter 286, The True Path. There was a moment of silence in class as everyone took a moment to absorb all the information. Soul cultivators were very rare, and often had odd occupations that made them difficult to counter. Lex thought back to the rascal invasion. Harry, despite being weaker than many, ended up doing some of the most damage to his enemies. But he wasn't just limited to that. As he was growing stronger, he was able to unlock more and more of his glamour sorcery abilities. While at the start, his skills were limited to giving people mental clarity, these days he could even grant a few buffs to customers that would last days. After giving his students enough time to ruminate about the new information he provided, the professor continued. Naturally, in the way body and spirit dual cultivators get the best of both worlds, anyone who dual cultivates the soul and spirit or soul and body also gets tremendous advantages. However, these combinations are even more difficult to achieve. Setting aside the difficulty of cultivating two paths, the real hurdle comes from the fact that unless the secondary cultivation path follows a technique that is complementary to the soul cultivation technique being used, it is nigh impossible to dual cultivate. It won't stop your progress in one, but rather, outright end your cultivation for both paths. It is for this reason that anyone who manages to find two complementary techniques often ends up killed, or creates a lineage. Even in the academy, getting access to such cultivation techniques is an extremely difficult task, not to mention the difficulty of following such a path afterwards. It is for that reason that you will rarely come across someone with these two combinations. But, while we're on the topic of cultivating multiple paths, I'm sure many of you are already wondering if it's possible to cultivate all three paths. All the students held their breath, and Lex felt an unusual sense of anticipation fill the class. Lex furrowed his brows. The students seemed to know something he didn't. But it didn't matter. Lex focused his attention on the professor, for this information would help him understand his limits better. He already had an explanation for why he was able to form an array so easily. His energy sensitivity had been heightened. Now it was time to know what else he could do. As you all probably suspect, it is indeed possible. In fact, not only is it possible, cultivating all three paths simultaneously is the actual true form of cultivation, and is what differentiates the many races in different categories. The latest _AP_SOTIs are on the NOVL/N website. The crystal race, for example, all cultivate all three paths simultaneously. In fact, for them it is normal cultivation, as they do not have divisions in the paths the way we do. Theoretically, it is still possible for all humans to practice all three paths as well, if enough of the right kinds of cultivation techniques are spread. But that begs the question, since the king is so adamant in developing the human race, why hasn't he done so? The answer is fairly simple. Humans inherently are not very suited to cultivate. Cultivating two paths already more than doubles the difficulty in raising realms, but cultivating all three, with the talent of the average human, would require hundreds of years just to break through one major realm to the next. Of course, one of the greatest benefits humans have over other races is our high reproduction rate. No matter how difficult or rare, someone capable enough to cultivate all three paths is bound to appear. I'm sure you are all familiar with one of the only two publicly known humans to cultivate all three paths, the king. Excitement, enthusiasm and admiration all filled the students. No one even seemed to care that none of them would ever be able to cultivate all three paths. After all, how could they compare to the king? Lex, however, was waiting for the professor to continue his explanation, but when he noticed that the professor was about to continue the class by progressing to a different topic, he interrupted to ask, "Professor, if the king is one of the two publicly known people to cultivate all three paths, who's the second? Also, what are the benefits of cultivating all three paths?" The students looked at him oddly, and even the professor was surprised by the question, but answered anyway. The second person is naturally the crown prince, who is set to inherit the throne. As for the benefits, well, I can only speculate. Firstly, and perhaps most impressively, the survival instinct of the cultivator, amplified by the energy sensitivity and soul sensitivity, will be enhanced 100-fold. In fact, it may even transcend the realm of survival instinct, and take another form that can sense more than just danger, due to the way the soul can sense intentions. I'd say, the cultivator's danger sense would probably end up being even better than cultivators in a higher realm. The control and sensitivity towards energy will also be exceptional. In the lower levels, it might not be so apparent, but in the nascent realm, when cultivators deal with different forms and levels of spiritual energy, the advantage will truly bear fruit. In fact, those cultivators can probably pursue some truly unique professions, by combining various compatible soul and spiritual professions. A simple example is by combining talismans and curses. Such things already exist, but require two or more cultivators to work together to form. The cultivator would also be extremely resilient. Fueled by spiritual energy, preserved by a strong body, and resistant to destruction due to the soul's own strength, the cultivator could probably easily survive wounds that would otherwise kill them. In fact, it would be so difficult to kill such a cultivator, I wouldn't be surprised if they walked through an erupting volcano. The professor suddenly froze as he seemed to recognize the student who had asked the question, and suddenly recalled some outlandish stories. Could it be? "Your name is Lex, right?" the professor asked. "Yeah," Lex answered, suddenly getting a bad feeling. In his mind, the professor was judging him for asking a question everyone knew the answer to, specifically, the one about who the second cultivator of all three paths was. It was because he had judged the rumor he heard about himself to be so outlandish, he never even considered people could take it seriously. Visit novelbin to read, please. How was he supposed to know that not only did this professor take it seriously, he suddenly filled in a few blanks about how the crown prince oppressed Lex, which was the reason he dropped his name. Furthermore, the stories of Lex's achievements, his survival during the expedition, along with his question about all three paths, could it be possible? In the most absurd, roundabout way, the professor made a conclusion about Lex cultivating all three paths, the first true conclusion anyone had made about Lex. Still, as a professor, he was mature enough to know not to spread rumors that he shouldn't. He did, however, silently decide to guide Lex to the best of his abilities. A basic enhancement of the individual abilities of all three paths is somewhat expected. The professor continued his class, suddenly a lot more serious. But if that were all, this would not be considered the true form of cultivation, and the gap between us and the crystal race would not be so huge. The higher the realm, the more evident the advantages will be, but even at a lower realm, such as the foundation realm, the cultivator outclasses his peers. The professor had to try very hard not to look at Lex as he said that. Each path has its own techniques. spiritual techniques for the spirit path, body techniques for body cultivators, and soul for soul cultivators. But, there are rumors that for the true path, as some people call it, there is another form of techniques that take advantage of all three paths. Similarly, some records of the king from his youth suggest that he used to practice a unique profession oblivator that no one else could, though there are no details of it available to the public. But, while those two previous aspects would require special information or heritages, there are other benefits as well. As many people know, the foundation realm is when cultivators commonly begin to explore specializations. Sword intent is a good example of a very commonly pursued specialization. It is said those who follow the true path have an entire field of specializations that they can realize on their own. For example, if a true cultivator pursued the sword, it would not be the sword intent they realized, but something more. Finally, the last rumor, and this is strictly a rumor, and has no proof or grounds for speculation, is that true cultivators can adopt any spiritual affinity they desire. This time, despite his efforts, the professor ended up looking Lex directly in the eyes. Lex gave away nothing, and wore the look of a simple, curious student. But it was already commonly accepted that Lex was exceptional, in which case, perfectly hiding his feelings fell perfectly within the realm of what he could achieve. The class continued normally after that, and once it was concluded, the professor submitted an application to see the dean, the king. Since he was just a normal professor, it would take months before he was granted the requested audience, if ever, but his speculations were too important to let slip to anyone. After class, Lex checked his PT and noticed he had a letter from Quenhild. She was inviting him once again to discuss her plan for the minor realms. After a moment's thought, he accepted the invitation. Chapter 287 Headache. For once Lex did not need to take public transport as Quenhild sent a private, small plane to pick Lex up. It was no bigger than the size of a regular car and was exceptionally fast. It was extremely luxurious, but that did not surprise him, considering her background. If only he knew that, after talking to him, she had severed her relationship with her father. Unfortunately for her, since her act was rather public, she had to face tremendous backlash. Even though the king himself could not be bothered to reprimand her, as the most worshipped figure in the nation, it was many of his fanatic followers who could not swallow the insult. But none of that had anything to do with Lex, nor did he know about it. The small plane landed on a rooftop landing pad in the high-rise building where Quenhild lived and Lex was escorted in. After being brought to a sitting room, he had to wait for a short while before Quenhild burst into the room, a wide grin on her face. Lex immediately noticed that she looked exhausted compared to the last time he saw her, but she was also clearly more energetic. "Lex, I'm so glad you came. I would have liked to invite you over just to get to know each other better before getting down to business, but I'm on a time crunch these days. I have to finalize my team for the minor realm so that we can start training together, which is why I'll get straight to the point. What can I do to convince you to join my team? Your survival skills and consultation could make a huge difference in trying to take over a minor realm." She was a lot more upfront than Lex expected, but the end result was the same. Lex had already given some thought to this, and was leaning towards joining her anyway, but since she was so open with her offer. "Since you've been so direct, then there's no point in me beating around the bush. There are a couple of things I have in mind, and if you can help me out, then I'll be more than happy to join you." "Go ahead. What do you need?" "Truth be told, I myself am searching for something that I expect can be found in the minor realms. I was planning on going to a few myself to search, but I have never been to a minor realm and don't know what to expect. I was, of course, going to start researching minor realms on my own, but I expect, since you are planning on capturing a minor realm, you've already done quite a bit of research. If you can provide me with all the information of the kinds of minor realms the Academy has opened up before, as well as what to expect, I wouldn't mind helping you out first. As for the second thing, well, considering I have to take care of my own expenses, let's keep it simple and settle on some money." It did occur to Lex to set some ridiculous conditions in exchange for his help, but doing so would put a strain on their relationship. Lex was not necessarily a materialistic person, but one would still have to be an idiot to ruin a good working relationship with an influential person for short-term gain. As it happened, his two requests perfectly fulfilled his needs, so it was good enough. Quenhild, who was expecting something much more lavish, was surprised by the simplicity of Lex's request. Her demure demeanor in front of Lex did not mean she was a simple or inexperienced person, and was well versed in the ways of the world. Considering the complexity of her request, Lex asking for such simple remuneration could be nothing other than a gesture of friendship. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the NOVL-BY-N website. If you don't mind me asking, what are you looking for in the minor realms? Maybe I can help you out with that. Lex did not reply, but only gave her a sly smile. There was no way to explain that he was searching for large reserves of natural energy, and he did not consider it a big deal that he should want to keep a few secrets. Seeing that Lex did not want to elaborate, she understood that it was likely a private matter. Regardless, she was not being greedy, and had only wanted to help. Since she could not help directly, then she would think of another way to respond to his gesture. Well, no matter. Your requests are simple enough, so we can begin immediately. I'll introduce you to my team. There will be a total of 12 of us, including you. The Academy will open the minor realms in 6 weeks, so during this time we need to work on our coordination and cooperation. Quenhild immediately started debriefing Lex over her plans, many of which surprised Lex. 12 was a very small number. How were they supposed to take over a minor realm with that? Or maybe his understanding of what it meant to take over a minor realm was flawed. Moreover, as he listened to her break down her plan for the next few weeks, and then the upcoming event itself, he let out a small, internal sigh. A very large part of him already knew this, but a small part of him had been hoping for some kind of miracle. He was hoping to stumble into a big enough pool of energy and somehow make it back in only a few short months, but more realistically, he was stuck here. The thought did not depress him, he had become more resilient than that, but it snuffed out the small hope he had been carrying. As it so happened that with the death of that small hope, Lex's mind opened up to a new series of possibilities. As he listened to Quenhild's plan, and saw how she took advantage of every possible opportunity, he became inspired. His new frame of thought was simple. As long as he was stuck here, he could continue to take advantage of his increased authority. In that case, instead of filling 100% of his energy reserves, he should continue to expand and improve the inn with his increased authority. This way, when he returned to the inn, it would be extremely well equipped to help him progress, not only as the innkeeper, but in his cultivation as well. After all, he did not want to spend hundreds of years on a single breakthrough, like his professor predicted. Though, he had a sneaking suspicion that if he could continue to have the lotus improve his body, his cultivation would be much quicker. Still, it made no sense not to use the advantages that he had. With this renewed mindset, Lex threw himself into his studies, practice, and preparation. Over the next few weeks, Lex thoroughly prepared himself by becoming familiar with his new techniques, upgrading his equipment with the truly insane amount of money Quenhild had paid him as an advance, and began to familiarize himself with Quenhild's team. Despite Lex's focus and determination, however, things did not always go over smoothly. First of all, his progress with the offensive technique evisceration was very slow. Lex had to be extremely careful while practicing it, for if something went wrong, he would end up injuring himself a lot. Furthermore, as predicted, regal embrace seemed to resist his efforts at using his technique. The only fortunate news he had in that regard was that his progress with arrays was good, and regal embrace did not seem to trouble him when the attack came from an array rather than a technique. Secondly, there were a couple members of Quenhild's team who clearly had a strong bias against Lex. They never showed it when the lady herself was around, but whenever she was absent, not only would they stop cooperating with him, they would actively try to antagonize him. Lex tried to mend the relationship, but after they rebuffed his attempts, he stopped caring. After all, he wasn't responsible if Quenhild's endeavor failed due to them. Furthermore, he was not at all afraid of them, for everyone in the group was in the Foundation realm, and Lex's instincts told him they could not harm a single hair on his body. Not to mention, if they ever tried to act against him, his survival instincts would warn him well in advance. Lastly, there were a couple of matters at the end that kept distracting him. Not only was the date for Earth's Expo coming closer, requiring him to start preparing for that somehow, but there was a group of troublesome people at the inn. Tiffany, after her victory at the Midnight Madness, had attracted a lot of attention, which was the true origin of the problem. Things got so out of hand that Mary finally informed Lex, who eventually recognized the once sweet and immature little girl. The problem now, though, was that despite her actual young age, she had the body of an adult. Since that was the case, no one suspected otherwise, and a Tiffany fan club had been established by a group of bachelors and bachelorettes from various planets. Every day, they would duel each other in public to attract her attention, recite the sappiest poems about her strength and reenact plays about her supremacy. Such a group, naturally, incited others, and quickly various fan clubs started meeting at the inn. Things were now already out of hand. The true problem occurred when Audrey Morrison, Alexander's grandmother, learned that she had a fan club who was competing with a fan club for Velma who, in turn, was competing with a fan club for Gerard. Lex rubbed his forehead, trying to alleviate his headache, as he never knew dealing with a bunch of simps was so difficult. After all, Audrey was not content with leaving things as they were, and insisted on the targets of the various fan clubs directly competing with one another. As for the method of competing? Naturally it was. Chapter 288 Lady Cosmos. Since Audrey was the one proposing the method of competition, and the focus of the challenge was to see who was the best and more worthy of having fans, she proposed a pageant. A tournament would have been more straightforward, but Audrey was not much of a fighter herself, not to mention the contestants were in various realms as well. That was all well and good, but it wasn't like anyone could be forced into participating in the pageant. Tiffany neither understood the concept, nor cared for such a pointless contest. A few others as well were not so keen on the idea. That's when the crowd started getting rowdy, and some even tried to harass the focus of various fan clubs. Let alone the fact that no one coming to the inn was weak, the huge fan bases themselves weren't ready to see their idols being targeted. A fight nearly broke out and was only contained due to the timely action by the security guards. Lex was very firm in his decision that such actions will not be tolerated. Anyone who harassed another guest would suffer a temporary ban from the inn, and the holographic personal assistants conveyed this message clearly to all guests. He hoped that this would be the end of the matter, but as he had become somewhat familiar with Audrey, he doubted it. And, indeed, the matter did not end there, though fortunately Audrey decided to be a lot more sensible in her next action. She went to Earth, acquired the rights to the competition known as Lady Cosmos, an annual international beauty pageant, and decided the next one would be held at the inn. Not only would the contestants be from the solar system, but from any star system that wished to join, making it the first ever, true Lady Cosmos. Brandon, who always supported his wife in every endeavor, immediately opened up his wallet. He immediately spent an astounding 1.5 million MP on the event, and had a detailed meeting with Mary about what they wanted for the event. Since they were planning the event to happen soon, only one Earth month away, Lex had to take time out from his already jam-packed schedule to settle the details for the event. This was not such a straightforward matter, as Audrey and Brandon were accompanied by their lawyer, who wanted to establish a detailed understanding of everything the event would entail. It was fortunate that Lex was not so easily flustered, regardless of how eloquently the lawyer spoke. Since the lawyer was bringing up various requirements, Lex cut the conversation short by asking one crucial thing. Would the inn simply be the venue for the event, or also take part in the organization of it? If the inn were only the venue, then they would only provide the basic facilities. However, if the inn were also organizing, then they would try to fulfill the competition's needs, but according to their own regulations. Lex neither had a detailed grasp of the various laws on Earth, nor cared for them. The inn was not subject to earthen law. In the end, they decided that the inn should help organize the event for them, but there were a couple of important conditions for that. There was no way to enforce Earth's trademarks or copyrights in space, but since the Inn was helping to organize this event, they had to agree not to host another beauty pageant with the same name in the future if it was sponsored by someone else. Furthermore, although Audrey did not care, the pageant was a business, and so they wanted to hash out the details of how they would generate income. Lex let Mary handle the details of negotiating how the income would be split after giving her an overview of what he wanted. He really didn't have the time to be dealing with stuff like that, but he did want a cut for organizing the event would take a lot more than a simple 1.5 million MP. In the end, after everything was concluded, Mary briefed Lex on everything so that he could use the event management panel to take care of everything. This was a prime example of how his increased authority was coming into use, for normally he would only be able to broadcast any event happening within the inn. However, Audrey wanted the event to be broadcast to every planet that sent a contestant, something he could barely manage. But first, he had to prepare for the event as well as advertise it. When he was holding the Midnight Games, he spent 50,000 MP per planet he advertised to, and sent the invitations to the leaders directly. This time, he planned to be slightly more subtle in his advertising, and also planned to advertise a little within the inn as well. He had a lot of guests going in and out every day, even from parts of the universe he had not connected planets to yet, so word of mouth would also serve him well. Counting Earth and Mars, as well as all the inhabited planets in the Nibiru, Vegas, and X-14 star systems, as well as the advanced way in which he wanted to spread the word, Lex directly spent 1 million MP on advertising. He spent another 40,000 MP on the venue, a large rectangular building with statues of gorgeous women wearing crowns, carved out of the finest marble standing 50 feet, 15.2 meters, tall near the entrance. They were the previous winner of the contest. The entrance was sealed for now, but a large marble plaque outside the venue stated the purpose of the venue, the details of the event, and how to register if anyone was interested. He would arrange for security, the broadcasting, and other miscellaneous tasks closer to the event itself. Done for now, Lex returned his attention back to training and studies. Currently, he was sitting in his Craven class, and the professor was discussing the biology of the strange creature that had managed to dominate their realm. Lex tried to focus back on class as he rubbed his temple. No matter how cultivation made his brain faster, it could not make up for how much he hated studying biology. Amidst all his studying, training, doing research and practicing his arrays, Lex had overlooked two simple facts. He had overlooked how vast the reach of his inn had actually become, and he had overlooked the universal love for beauty. He had grossly underestimated how many guests this next event would attract. X-142, a farming village. Haley was slowly trudging back home after a long, exhausting day at the farm. Considering her peak Foundation realm cultivation, the difficulty of her routine was self-evident. She had lived her whole life in a farming village and from a young age she had been taught the wonders their farming produced. The value of their crop was phenomenal, which is why it took years of hard work for a single crop yield. She had believed, she had worked, and she had toiled just to be qualified to be a farmer. But when she actually got to work, spending 16 hours a day, waist-deep in mud, nourishing the crops with fertilizer with her own hands, she realized there was no glamour in the life she had always pursued, and there was next to no reward. She got paid for her work, but even if one ignored the ridiculously small amount of pay, considering her cultivation, she never had the physical or mental energy to do anything. Today was more of the same, and after returning home and taking a shower, she flung her frail body in bed. But, as much as she wished to immediately fall asleep, her body ached too much to let her fall asleep. Eventually, she gave up, and pulled out an old news crystal. She got this the last time she visited a city, many months ago, but by now, she had memorized the entire thing. Every news article, every bit of gossip, every ADV, In the upcoming events, something new had suddenly appeared. For a moment she was dazed, and tried to remember if she had seen this before. But that was impossible, her memory would not fail her, especially when she had read through this crystal numerous times. What was going on? More curious than anything, she read the new article that had appeared out of thin air. It was a pageant for the most capable and talented women in the cosmos. For a moment, she let herself imagine a life in which she could enter something like that, and her wings, fair and beautiful, involuntarily stuttered. Then, the news article shone with a golden light and enveloped her. When the light disappeared, she was no longer in her home, but stood in the middle of a road, cutting through a massive field. A hologram of another Kiansa, a winged subspecies of humans, appeared before her and said with the most radiant of smiles, "Welcome to the Midnight Inn." Chapter 289, The Capitalist Returns. Haley was bewildered, and for a moment, couldn't understand what was happening. Then she tried pinching herself to ensure she was awake. Just as her thoughts were about to spiral, her assistant continued speaking. "Do not be alarmed, dear guest, if this is your first visit to the Midnight Inn. The only way in and out of the inn is through teleportation, and you were teleported here due to your interest in the Lady Cosmos pageant. You are free to leave whenever you so desire, and the inn takes special care of security, so you are completely safe here." The Lady Cosmos competition, she repeated, her attention directly diverting to what she cared most about. "Why would I be brought here for the Lady Cosmos pageant?" "Why, to register, of course. The pageant is in a month, but participants are suggested to arrive a few days before the event so that you can become familiar with the format of the pageant and make preparations. Of course, you can register any time between now and when the event actually starts." "I can be in the pageant," she repeated, dumbstruck. Noveltop1.org. Naturally, the hologram replied once again. Haley was dumbstruck, and she looked once again at the wonderland that she had been transported to. Was this really not a dream? Earth, Interstellar Confinement Facility. Vera Joel, a political prisoner and a secret oracle, was scribbling mindlessly in her notebook. She was bored out of her mind. It wasn't because the facility they were locked in was like a prison. No, the facility had everything from various sports courts, cinemas, shopping malls, schools and much, much more. After all, the difference between a political prisoner and a real prisoner was vast. They couldn't really be mistreated. The one constraint on them, though, was that after the discovery of the Midnight Inn, they were regularly checked for golden keys. Even if they wouldn't be able to go anywhere else from the inn, no one wanted to take a chance. And so she was stuck. Until something changed, and she saw a vision of a new future. Her expression changed from boredom to excitement in a flash, and she sprinted to find her mother, Christine Joel. She whispered something in her ears, before the two jaunted off to a nearby store. From the shelf, they picked up a couple of magazines, and quickly returned to their rooms. "Are you sure?" Christine asked, but the only response she got was a flash of golden light. Her daughter had already found a small ad for the Lady Cosmos pageant and had teleported to the inn. Christine shook her head and quickly looked through her own magazine. A moment and a flash later, she too was gone. Countless other women, or it would be more accurate to say females, from various parts of the universe began to learn about the Lady Cosmos pageant and started arriving at the inn, one by one. Some saw the ads in magazines, some in news crystals, some in unskippable YouTube ads, and some saw the venue at the inn itself. But, surprisingly enough, it wasn't Lex's own advertising that spread the word the most. It was the Iron Heart Pirates, the one for which Booty was first mate, that did the brunt of the work. From port to port, planet to planet, star system to star system, they spread the word and enticed any who would be willing to listen. It need not be said that they recruited more members for the audience than they did actual candidates, for the love of beauty and competition thrived just as much in the worst of degenerates as it did in cultured socialites. Naturally, they charged a premium for anyone who wanted a key for the inn from them. After all, the innkeeper wouldn't mind if they made a little pocket money while doing so much legwork, right? Completely unbothered by the steadily increasing traffic at the inn, Lex continued his routine. Maintaining the mindset that Mary would let him know if anything went wrong, Lex was completely dedicated to being fully prepared for the minor realm. After all, this was the only time he would have. The pageant would begin right before he had to head to the minor realm, and the two events would likely overlap. Soon after that would be Earth's Expo. Speaking of which, Miranda should probably be coming by the inn soon to discuss the details for the event. It was like this that Lex spent his time, the month gradually passing by, right up until 8 days before the Lady Cosmos pageant. 1 week before the event began, the participants were encouraged to come to the inn so that they could start preparing. Lex thought everything was under control, for he had once again purchased the unlimited rooms option that he had once gotten for the midnight games. He was planning on purchasing the same kind of security as well and continued to let Mary handle things, but that's when she called for his attention. "Lex, I think the venue for the event is going to end up being too small. We're also going to need more temporary staff to handle the influx of new guests." "Oh? How come? Did we end up getting a lot of participants?" A lot was a relative term, and Mary didn't know what Lex was expecting. When he only advertised briefly on only 3 planets, he had tens of thousands of guests, so he should have adjusted for the inn's new reach, right? Not too many. Due to Audrey handling things on Earth, we only have about 30,000 contestants from there and Mars, combined. Due to various other restrictions as well, such as sex, age, and the requirement for a physical body, the number of contestants was also dropped to about only 2.6 million. After Mary had to stop giving her report because Lex, who had been leaning against a wall when he heard the report, slipped and fell, attracting the attention of Quenhild and their teammates. "Excuse me, I'll be right back," Lex said quickly as he quickly got up and rushed to the toilet. "Repeat that again. How many contestants do we have?" "Approximately 2.6 million, Mary replied calmly. "After having a discussion with the marketing and publicity manager Audrey has hired for the event, we came to the conclusion that the low turnout is due to a lack of trust or recognition of the pageant in the universe. After the first one airs, and people become familiar with the brand, turnout should be much higher. Of course, we can keep the participants in their rooms while it's not their turn, and thus manage them. But we can't force the guests to stay in their rooms all the time. Some of them will want to view the event in person." "Mary, did you say there are 2,600,000 contestants in the beauty pageant?" "Yes. It's a good thing Audrey was in charge on sifting through the applicants from Earth, otherwise, if everyone who applied was able to participate, we would have tens of millions of contestants during the first portion of the event." After he recovered from the initial shock, Lex's mind started working in overdrive and he quickly realized he had been underestimating the allure of a model on a catwalk. Leaving the bathroom, he promptly told Quenhild that he had some urgent business he needed to take care of, and left. On his journey back to his apartments, he continued to listen to Mary's briefing. It was tough to estimate how many guests there would be for this event, but Mary informed Lex that the Iron Heart pirates had bought several million keys from them the last few weeks. Honestly, the pirates' hard work needed to be commended. It was not easy to travel to so many star systems in such a short time. Not only had they divided their crew into various, smaller groups to advertise to as many systems as possible, they had been working non-stop. After all, there was no such thing as a repeat customer for them. Once their customer visited the inn a single time, they would be able to get their own keys. So, to make money, they worked non-stop. Lex momentarily considered hiring the pirate crew before dismissing the thought. He had other things to focus on for now. As soon as he reached home, a particular gleam filled his eyes. If Lex were a cartoon, his eyes would have transformed into giant dollar signs, as the capitalist in him had woken up once again now with added authority. First and foremost, Lex checked how much MP he currently had. Over the past few weeks, due to the increased number of guests, his income had seen a small boost. During this time, he had made a decent 400,000 MP considering how cheap his rooms, services, and food were. This figure spoke volumes about the number of guests he'd had. That left him with a total of 7,311,000 MP. It had been a while since Lex went on a crazy spending spree. He cracked his knuckles and got to work. Chapter 290 Lex's first The burden the inn was about to be placed under was immense. The most guests it had had at its peak was a few tens of thousands. Going from that to a few million was a massive jump, and the inn lacked the infrastructure to manage such demand. A lot of temporary solutions would be available in the event management panel, but the foundation of the inn itself would also require an upgrade. First things first, Lex had to upgrade his supply for spiritual food, which would require an upgrade of the greenhouse. Speaking of which, it had been many months now since the greenhouse had been completely overhauled, and the gardener's art was really beginning to show. The way the plants grow, the way the bushes create outlines, the shading of the various kinds of grass as well as the growing vegetables, all came together to form an image of Little Blue when seen from above. But even so, the image was not fully formed. Suddenly, Lex felt like he really had been wasting the gardener's talents. After thinking on it for a moment, Lex bought 10 more permanent workers and put the gardener in charge of them. Instead of taking care of the greenhouse, Lex let him take care of the greenery around the Midnight Manor. Having him take care of the entire inn would require too many workers. The workers cost him 35,000 MP, and setting aside their salary for the next 3 months cost him another 16,000 MP. Being given a job where he only needed to care for the aesthetics and presentation dramatically improved the gardener's mood. After that, Lex spent another 100,000 MP on increasing the size of the greenhouse by 10 acres. The turtle would remain in charge of growing food, and now, without the gardener focusing on using the plants to supplement his art, he would be able to focus on maximum sustainable productivity. Now, he turned his attention to the inn. Quite frankly, with the current size of the inn, it was impossible to fit several million people here, let alone tens of millions, without severely crowding the entire place. He turned his attention to Main Street. As much as he wanted to avoid this initially, it was inevitable. He created a street branching off, henceforth known as Avalon Street, for that was the first building in it, and created 4 more high-rises of similar size. Since the Avalon had cost him 300,000 MP, adding 4 more took up 1.2 million MP. He created more branches off Main Street, and added another battle tower, full of training rooms. On another street, he created a temple similar to the Blue Mosque in design, and filled it with meditation rooms. He had to create several more restaurants as well, and overall expanded Main Street several times its size. All of these expenses took up another 200,000 MP, and hiring all the relevant staff, which was about another 100 workers, cost him a devastating 510,000 MP, which included hiring them, giving them living quarters, and setting aside their pay for the next 3 months. He spent another 2 million MP on increasing the size of the inn by another 200 acres, and filled the area with countless small, lone cabins as well as smaller settlements. Previously, the biggest rental room he could build was a courtyard, which had 4 individual rooms. Now, taking advantage of his increased authority, he could also build small houses, large houses, mansions, and a small village. These were not the houses and villages Lex built on his own, but rather rental units backed by the system, meaning they could only be rented by a single person or group. The small house charged 600 MP a night, and had 5 bedrooms, each with their own restroom, a lounge, a living room, a small storeroom, and a kitchen. The large house charged 2,000 MP a night, and had 8 bedrooms, a lounge, 2 living rooms, an empty basement, a large kitchen, a single meditation room, and a small swimming pool. Though the meditation room was a part of the house, to use it would cost its usual daily fee of 100 MP a day. A mansion was about half the size of the Midnight Manor, had 12 rooms, a conference room, a lounge, a couple of living rooms, a basement, 2 kitchens, 3 meditation rooms, 3 training rooms, 1 recovery room, a massive swimming pool, a massive backyard, and a dedicated butler. Lex decided to keep the rent for the mansion at 5,000 MP a night. It need not be said that the mansion, as well as the houses, afforded total privacy, and no one would be able to peek in, even if you were in the backyard. The small village consisted of 5 courtyards, 3 small houses, 2 large houses, and a single mansion, its own restaurant, its own team of dedicated workers, a massive open ground, and a small monument in the center of the village. Since Lex could customize the monument, he decided to shape it after the galactic sovereign turtle. Again, it needed to be mentioned that, despite its size and capacity, this village could not be rented by the house or courtyard, but had to be rented collectively by a person or group. Lex decided to set the rent of the small village at 15,000 MP a night. This was technically, not actually the limit of what he could build, as there were still options after a small village, but at this point they were getting too expensive for him to place as he still needed to save MP for the actual event management itself. In the end, he ended up spending 500,000 MP on placing the various rooms, courtyards, houses, and villages. This left him with 2,750,000 MP remaining. To be honest, he had not even come close to making enough arrangements for dealing with millions of people, but that would have to wait for when he started earning money from this event. Since the inn was a part in organizing the event as well, instead of only hosting it, all further payments for the event that Brandon was supposed to make were deferred, and instead, a percentage of the income generated from the event itself would go towards the inn. To be clear, this did not count any profit the inn made by renting out rooms or giving out services. Only the income generated from aspects directly related to the event would count as earnings from the event, and Mary had negotiated a hefty 80% share in the inn's favor for the income. In her words, she had been very generous, even leaving them with 20% of the profits. Whether it was generous or not, when Lex saw the various ways in which they expected to earn from the event, he was extremely satisfied. He spent another 200,000 MP on enlarging the venue. If this was a permanent building, it would cost much more, but since it was only temporary, this was more than enough to enlarge the building enough to seat 500,000 people. He could continue to enlarge the building, but after a certain point it just became ridiculous to expand further. He told Mary to think of ways in which they could comfortably seat more people. Then, he spent 1,500,000 MP on event security. The last time, he had spent 450,000 MP and had gotten 10 Earth Immortals guards and a few hundred below that level. This time, he was looking forward to what he got. Still, Mary told him not to expect too much. The reason his bodyguard has been so powerful last time was because he had spent all that money on one individual. Since this time the amount was spread amongst various guards, they likely wouldn't be at that level. As it turned out, she was right. 2,000 Golden Core Peak Guards, 200 Nascent Peak Guards, 30 Peak Earth Immortals Guards, and 1 guard at the realm above Earth Immortal were summoned from a flash of golden light. Lex found it interesting that even with his increased authority, he could not see above the Earth Immortal realm. Yet what he found even more interesting was that he recognized many of these guards. They were the same ones he had summoned last time during the Midnight Games. It seemed like the system was getting these guards from a specific place. That was something Lex needed to remember, for it was another clue into understanding the system and how it worked. It was also important to note that, up until Earth Immortal, all guards were humans, but the guard above it was not. As for the species of the strongest guard, with brown scales as smooth as polished metal covering its reptilian body, for wings that spanned 100 feet, 30 meters, each, claws that could rip through a moon, and a maw as rugged as it was malevolent, Lex did not even need to scan to recognize a dragon. The first he had ever seen. Chapter 291 Party Village. It was not just Lex who was awestruck by the massive beast, nay, dragon that had appeared in a vast, open area of the inn. Longtime guests, and especially all the workers, had become accustomed to the unannounced expansions the inn occasionally went through. They would all come outside and admire the buildings appearing out of thin air, and the inn spontaneously becoming bigger. It was a good reminder of the power wielded by the mysterious Innkeeper. But the number of guests who were seeing this for the first time outnumbered those who knew what was happening. Even after they were assured this was a normal occurrence, they were curious. They had heard about the Innkeeper, but it had been months since he was gone, and since the number of guests coming had only increased recently, most had never met him, or even actually know about him. After all, how frequently would one bump into the owner of any establishment? So when these first-timers were basking in the changes, and a massive, deadly-looking dragon appeared surrounded by what looked like an army, many of them instantly froze. An air of tension and uncertainty filled the air. They were unsure if they should be screaming or running, or if this was just another occurrence at the inn. But the tension lasted only a moment, for Mary announced the identity of the new arrivals, and everyone dispersed. While they were only temporary guards, they were guards nonetheless, and so all came under Gerard's command. For all other than the immortals and the dragon, he started passing out instructions and began explaining their plans for security during the event. While it may seem that a few thousand guards were too few to manage millions of people, when considering the average person in the universe, a golden core cultivator was already much stronger than them. But, even if they weren't enough, immortals were absolutely rare. Under normal circumstances, a leisure-based event such as this would not usually attract the attention of anyone at that level. The only reason, in fact, that the Midnight Games managed to attract so many high-level cultivators was because it directly interfered with the interests of various powerful entities. Even then, it was the silent deterrence of the Celestial, Lex's bodyguard at the time, that managed to dissuade the devils from causing problems. Otherwise, there was no telling what kind of mess they would have caused. Lex finally finished admiring the dragon, and then turned his attention to his current remaining MP of 1,050,000. He had to stop spending now to handle any emergencies that rose up, but the income from the event should start pouring in soon. Just to be sure, however, he instructed Mary to, in passing, show the Dragonburn locket. It was an item he had gotten from the Emporium back on X142 and had priced it at 10 million MP. It could help dragons gain a deeper understanding of the intricacies of breathing fire. Lex did not have a complete understanding of dragons and how valuable their fire-breathing powers were, so he originally felt like a price of 10 million was very hefty. Now though, when he considered how vast the universe really was, and the fact that he could earn millions from a single planet, if, by chance, dragons were really as esteemed as myths on Earth, that price may be too low. After deliberating a bit, he altered the price to 50 million. If it was too high a price, he would change it eventually, and if it was too low a price, he would treat it as a learning experience. Either way, he was done for now. Over the next 5 days, Lex kept a close eye on the inn while he went about his daily routine. The number of guests coming in had jumped drastically, and about 400,000 guests had already come into the inn. All the permanent rooms were eventually booked out, and the temporary rooms that Lex had paid for that didn't really occupy any space started to take in the rest of the guests. Even if each guest only took a normal room, which most did not, with the price being 50 MP a night, and there being 400,000 guests, Lex would have been earning 20 million MP a night. The actual figure currently was around 31 million MP last night, just from rooms. And this figure was rising each day, for more and more guests started to arrive. The total MP he accumulated in these 5 days, with rental and food and services all included, was 145 million MP. Well, actually it was a bit more than that, but for the sanity of the OCD prone, he quickly spent the extra MP rounding it off to a nice number. The official event hadn't even started yet and Lex was practically drowning in MP. The absolute ecstasy of his wealth was only matched by the overwhelming effort it took to manage such a crowd. He had to take more days off from training as well as classes, causing Quenhild to become slightly concerned, but Lex assured her that everything was under control. In fact, everything was not under control. From Main Street to the Manor, to the lake and the lazy river, to Midnight Mountain, there was a massive crowd of people. In the end, Lex had to do something drastic since he didn't want to destroy the careful atmosphere he had been nurturing in the inn. Spending a no longer significant 30 million MP, he added 3,000 acres of land to the inn. Up until now, whenever he expanded the inn, he ensured to maintain a round shape for the inn. The latest expansion, however, was not balanced, and instead stretched the inn behind Midnight Mountain, letting the lone mountain stand as a sort of border between the two sides of the inn. In the new area, he decided to create a party village. That was a bad name, he hadn't decided what to officially call it yet, but the concept was that this was the part of the inn where all future large events would take place from now on. This way, the main area could remain relatively uncrowded for those guests who just wanted to visit the inn. For those that wanted a more happening scene, the village was the destination. Since he currently had an abundance of MP, he decided to make permanent additions instead of temporary ones to design the village. Furthermore, he really let his creativity flow this time around. Starting out with a few big attractions, in the center of the village was a very traditional-looking coliseum that could easily seat 1 million guests, nothing too extravagant. Then, just for good measure, he added a massive, floating orb of water above the coliseum, inspired by something he saw in a game called Final Fantasy X. What was the purpose of a giant ball of water? How could it be used? What would people think? These were all questions he decided to let his guests answer themselves. Of course, the orb was high enough that it would not obstruct any activities happening in the Colosseum grounds themselves. Next, he created a 1,000-story pagoda in another corner of the village. Its purpose? To be determined. Next, for good measure, he built 50, 100-story high-rises filled with rentable rooms, all interconnected with bridges built on different levels in a corner of the village. Of course, he was no architect, so making the bridges look nice was somewhat of a challenge, so he decided to turn all the bridges into parks as well, with grass and bushes and trees, connecting each of the buildings. In another corner of the village, he added a small, crystal-clear lake. It wasn't too big, only 20 acres large, and built a few hundred houses, added pathways, replaced what could have been parks with coral reefs, and of course, did not forget to designate a portion as an underwater combat arena. Over another portion of the village that he populated with various kinds of large auditoriums, music halls, palaces, and the likes, was the aerial part of the village. 100 buildings ranging from small to medium, floating at a certain point in the air, all connected thin walkways. Clouds floated through the city, and many birds visited this unique paradise that one could reach either by flying, or taking one of the many elevator platforms. Hot air balloons surrounded the floating village, adding bright colors to the otherwise mostly silver site. Of course, Lex also had to take care of transport between the village and the main portion of the inn. Several trails existed for those who wanted to walk, going around, and some even over the mountain. For those that did not want to walk, he provided many options that could be taken from a few terminals he placed around the inn. There was naturally the option for horse, rhino, and golf cart riding. A lazy river was also an option, this time with the option of gondolas as well as the floating plastic donuts. But it was when Lex was designing a train route when he was struck by another brilliant idea, if he did say so himself. Chapter 292, Steam Train. Lex looked at how much MP he had spent. Due to the size of his many massive structures, the cost ended up being a lot more than anticipated. For example, just a single one of the 100-story high-rises cost him 450,000 MP each. Adding 50 of them then cost him 22.5 million MP. The Colosseum, the city in the sky and the underwater city, as well as all the additional buildings in between them, cost him another 31 million MP. Obviously, maintaining all these buildings would require sufficient staff as well. Although the inn automatically took care of maintenance and various other services, minimizing the need for actual workers, it was only minimized and not reduced. He hired 3,000 more workers solely for the village, with the full expectation that he would need to hire more soon. Hiring them, plus putting away their salaries for the next few months, cost Lex another 11.7 million MP. While he allowed Mary to decide their jobs and the division of labor for most of them, he gave her instructions to select 100 of them for a special designation. In his system, he had a panel called Employee Benefits, which he had so far only used to distribute pay, give them homes, and pass out basic cultivation techniques. Now, however, it was time to make further use of the panel. He went into specializations and selected architecture, civil engineering, and city planning, and designated those 100 workers with these specializations. They wouldn't become overnight specialists in these fields, but would be provided relevant knowledge about them. The same way they had to cultivate on their own, the workers would have to study the new material. Once they were sufficiently educated in the fields, he would have them work on expansion plans for the village and, if he was satisfied, then on Main Street and the rest of the inn. After all, currently, while the village seemed fine, it lacked a sense of cohesion. The large structures in various corners all had drastically different styles, and the city looked more like a hot pot of different designs than a unified whole. He planned on having these workers, who were now a part of the planning and expansion division of the inn, gain experience with the village, which had more allowance for errors. After all, the whole purpose of the village was to host large events, so the focus could be slightly diverted towards function over finesse. With that done, though, he turned his attention back to transport. This was yet another thing that would be under the purview of the planning department, but he created several terminals for an underground subway system. The trains created by the system were completely silent and levitated off the ground, so they caused no vibrations. This way, guests could be quickly transported throughout the inn without hassle. Naturally, this did not mean he discontinued the golf cart service led by Gerard's former crew. They had developed some fans of their own. Unexpectedly, the underground train system was more expensive than he expected, and cost 15 million MP. This, however, still left him with 35,850,000 MP to spend on his idea. He remembered, when he was a child, and would travel with his family, they would often take trains to travel overnight. For some reason, the allure of spending the night on a train was beyond comparison when he was a child. Since it was something he used to enjoy, there was no reason others wouldn't enjoy it as well. He spent the next few hours fiddling with the system interface, trying to get his idea just right. Once he was done with that, he spent several more hours planning a train route. The route had to be close enough so that those on board could see the various sights and sceneries the inn offered. This train's only terminal was in a street branching off from Main Street, and its path would begin with a visit around the lake. It would then loop around to the forest surrounding the greenhouse, and would make its way through the grassy slopes to come into view of the Midnight Manor. From there it would go towards the hill with the meditation rooms, visit the mystery trial, go through a tunnel in the Midnight Mountain and then visit the various sites in the village, including the underwater and floating portions of the city since it wasn't actually a steam train, before looping around and ending back at the terminal. This train, which bore the appearance of a steam train, would move much slower on its track, allowing its passengers to enjoy the scenery passing them by. But the purpose of this train was not transport. No, this train was full of rooms that could be booked. Unfortunately, due to needing to meet the standards of the inn, there could only be a very limited number of rooms. The train had 9 cabins behind the engine, and 8 of those cabins could only be rented as a whole. Each cabin contained a small, cozy room, a relatively large sitting area furnished with the finest carpets, sofas and tables, with a view on either side, and a bathroom. Naturally, anyone who rented a cabin could share it and bring multiple guests along, but ultimately each cabin would belong to one person or party. The 9th cabin was the kitchen and, through clever use of teleportation that Lex's increased authority allowed him to enable, a waiter could go directly from the kitchen to any cabin that ordered food. This particular project cost Lex another 2 million MP, and he decided to set the rent for each cabin at 1,000 MP a night. Now, there were a few other things that needed his attention. Even today, a month later, Haley found everything surreal. Even as she listened to the explanation for the different portions of the pageant, how each portion would be judged, and how she should prepare, she felt like she was in a dream. She was but a simple farmer girl who would spend her days working the land, and her nights dreaming while still awake. She longed for a different life, imagined herself changing overnight and seizing the day, living fabulously without any regrets. But her longings were supposed to remain as longings, her dreams remain as dreams. Whether it was a lack of courage, or an addiction to the pain of a substandard life, something was stopping her either way. But, in the mundane routine that was her life, an accident had flipped everything over. After all, it had to be an accident. Someone like her couldn't be destined for such things. But whatever it was, her life had changed with that one flash of gold that night. As she explored the inn, on that day she had stumbled into this fairy tale, too afraid that she would wake up the next second. She ran into a rather handsome man named Harry. One look at her, in her dusty old clothes, tangled hair, untidy wings and eyes full of wonder, was all it took for him to see something she herself had never seen. He asked her to let him do a makeover, and when she told him she couldn't afford his prices, for she truly could not, he said he'd do it for free. Haley was a proud woman, simple though she may be, and would have normally never accepted such charity. But whether it was the magic in the air, or the excited look in his eyes when he saw her, something forced her to accept his offer. The second accident that day. That man, Haley blushed, the color running down to her neck as she thought of him, was a maestro. When he wielded his scissors and his comb, his expression changed. His eyes were sharp and his hands fast, yet Haley felt not a single tug of her hair as he worked on her, only a tenderness that nearly caused her to shiver. It wasn't as if Haley was unaware of the ways of the world, nor was she a prude, but somehow she lost all her words that day. It was not just her hair that he worked on, no, he also groomed her wings. When folded, they fit nicely behind her back, barely visible, but when extended, they stretched even beyond the length of her arms. Her wings, as dark as her hair, had never been groomed, for they would just get dirty and messed up again the next day at the farm. But as he untangled her curls and brushed their length, she felt like ropes that had been tying her down had been cut. Many hours later, when she stepped out of his store, her sun-kissed skin practically glowed under the light of the sky lanterns and her long, flowing hair hiding her wings perfectly. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger looking back at her. The stranger was too neat, too clean, too perfect. It was not like how real people looked, at least in her experience. But, instead of the mirror, when she looked at Harry with his crooked smile and dazed eyes, she got a feeling, deep in her heart, that she must have looked beautiful. Chapter 293 Builder of Bonfires. Gathering herself, Haley thanked Harry for the makeover, and they started talking. She explained that she had been summoned to the inn for the pageant, but, after the initial overwhelming rush of emotions, she was having serious doubts about entering. It wasn't like she was unaware of what a pageant was. Just because she was a farm girl did not mean she was uneducated or uncultured. Instead, she felt like she would only end up making a fool of herself by competing. Harry, the stranger she had just met today, listened quietly to her story as she expressed her doubts, and in the end, only said one thing. He said that if she felt reluctant, or pressured by it, then she did not need to force herself. After all, the inn would not force her to enter just because she had come here, but that he felt it would be a pity if she didn't. After that they parted ways, for Harry had his own tasks he needed to take care of, but more importantly, she had been gone quite a while and was probably already late for her duties at the farm. But she could not leave. Her mind kept wondering about the things that had been left unsaid. Why would it be a pity if she didn't participate? Was it because he thought she had a shot at winning, or did he just want to see her more? But, a bigger question also burdened her mind. What did it mean for her if she entered the pageant? Would her life change? Or would she just end up back at the farm after a fleeting moment of freedom? 100 different thoughts were running through her mind, so that she did not notice a few kids in her path, and bumped into them. Just as she was about to apologize, the kids looked up at her in wonder and exclaimed, "A fairy." Perhaps he meant that Haley looked like a beautiful and enchanting woman, straight out of a storybook when he called her that. She, instead, heard something different. On her planet, and often in most other places in the universe, fairies were one of the most oppressed species. Their high affinity for spiritual abilities and innate abilities, paired with the general weakness of their species, made them perfect targets to be taken advantage of. Of course, in X-142 they were not treated like slaves, but, whatever the case, she did not want to live the life of a fairy. With her decision made, she registered for the pageant, and now, nearly a month later, she had let the other farmhands know she was taking an extended leave and had come to the inn. 2 days later, the pageant would begin, and it would be broadcast to many worlds. They were already being briefed on the many divisions of the pageant, and what to do when their turn comes. Though, the first thing they were advised, and very strongly at that, was they should not reveal their names and the planets they were from for their own safety. Should any opportunities for a career as a celebrity or anything else really present itself, then they would contact the Lady Cosmos organization in the inn first, and the organization would then contact the participants. With that, not at all scary advice out of the way, Haley began practicing. In 2 days, when the event began, the first portion would be talent. According to the cultivation level, each contestant would be placed in a different group and judged on different parameters. This was so everyone was judged fairly, and no one used their cultivation as an advantage. Over the last 2 days, as more and more people came to the inn, Lex was entirely focused on managing the crowd and ensuring there were no problems. Once the event actually began, he would become relatively freer since he was not the one overseeing the event. In these past 2 days, he earned another 63 million MP, bringing his total to 96,850,000 MP. The MP came just in time, for now he had to finish setting up the actual event. Spending 68 million MP and 0.3% of his remaining 1.5% energy accumulation, he established the broadcasting for the event. Any planet, moon, asteroid, spaceship or anything else from which a participant came would end up receiving a broadcast of the show. The place of origin was advanced enough to have some form of television or streaming service. The system would integrate the broadcast into it. Otherwise, a massive projection in the sky would appear anywhere with a large enough group of living beings. Another 5 million MP went into establishing a sentiment analysis feature, which would judge how the audience reacted to different participants, which would end up being one of 3 categories in which they would be judged. Finally, he came to the part that personally interested him the most: his income. The inn itself would not put any advertisements during its broadcast, but if any local entities tried to put in ads between the show, then 95% of their profits would be transferred to the inn automatically. Then, naturally, there was the numerous merchandise for the Lady Cosmos show. The apparel was no longer limited to just t-shirts, but also included suits, dresses, gowns, saris, kimonos, and hundreds of other traditional dresses from each planet participating in the show. Then, as per usual, there was the betting pool. Finally, he would also implement an idea Mary gave him. According to her, a majority of the participants were financially struggling. So they decided to implement a very common feature of many platforms on Earth, wherein the audience could support the participants they liked by sending them gifts. The inn would take 1% of the value for each gift as revenue for Lady Cosmos, but the rest would be given to the participants themselves. Setting up all this cost him another 10 million MP, leaving him 13,850,000 MP. That was more than enough to deal with any emergency that popped up. 1 day later, the event finally kicked off. In the end, the number of participants who actually showed up for the event was only 1.5 million, a lot lower than the number who registered, but no one was complaining. With a majority of all issues handled, Lex breathed a sigh of relief and turned his attention back to the Crystal Realm. They would begin their excursion to the Minor Realm in less than 2 weeks. He had to be ready. Earth, unnamed island in the middle of the ocean. Emperor Silius, first of his name, savior of the luggage, fisherman supreme, builder of bonfires and makeshift barbecues, stared in a daze at the broken TV screen that was still embedded into the airplane seat. He had no idea how long it had been since the commercial plane he was on crash-landed on this island. Almost everyone on the plane survived, but after what seemed like thousands of years and no rescue, nothing to do and barely surviving by foraging what little they could, most had lost hope and some, unlike Emperor Silius, had lost their minds. Of course, the patchy beard on his face indicated barely a month had passed, but who cared about these technicalities? But the supremely important thoughts in which he was lost were interrupted by a sound too alien to this island: music. Alarmed, he looked up and saw that the TV screen latched into the seat in front of him had turned on, despite the prominent lack of electricity and any kind of signals, and was playing some kind of introduction. Confounded, he looked around and saw that all the TV screens had turned on, and he wasn't the only one who had noticed. All the passengers who had been resting in the shade of the plane were alarmed. Was this a case of mass hysteria? Lady Cosmos, screamed the diva queen in excitement, a ruthless and ferocious adversary who had kept Emperor Silius on his toes. But, since this strange magic seemed to be the domain of this queen, the various lords and ladies turned to her for guidance. But she was too engrossed in the show to pay attention. Planet SSY 534, Plains of Carnage. 4 separate armies clashed together in an epic free-for-all. There was no indication of what these beasts and aliens fought for, or where their allegiance lay, for none wore armor or identifying tags, but the soldiers themselves seemed to know their enemies. Like rain, blood fell to the ground; like thunder, bodies clashed in the skies; like the wind, carnage washed over all. This was a planet owned by no one, but housed the largest black market in the nearest 1,000 star systems. Anyone from pirates, merchants, contractors, artists, and even actual lords and ladies visited this planet for some reason or another. On an unowned planet, where the rules and regulations of the wild were rampant, such a brutal war was not an uncommon sight. What was uncommon, however, was a massive projection appearing randomly in the sky above said armies, with the most unusual music playing. The soldiers did not stop fighting, but the commanders of the armies looked up in confusion. Was this some new tactic? Since when had their enemies become so devious? Chapter 294, Small Performance. Each of the commanders for the 4 armies looked warily at one another, while also keeping an eye on the projection in the sky. Their senses were deployed to the maximum, and as soon as something unusual happened they would be able to respond to it. But, once the introductory song ended, instead of a conniving plan of some kind, a fabulously dressed woman appeared in the projection. It was Audrey. "Welcome one and all, to the first ever, Interstellar Lady Cosmos pageant," rang her voice across the plains. Oddly enough, the one army that consisted of a race that had no ears felt her meaning communicated to them through the extrasensory form of communication they normally used. Audrey began explaining a little about the pageant, since most viewers were probably not familiar with the concept, but the commanders were simply bewildered. Try as they might, they could not find the source of the projection. The battle on the ground continued, and while the soldiers were slightly distracted by Audrey talking, they managed to continue the fight. Until, that is, over Audrey's monologue, they started a slideshow of glimpses of some of the contestants, dressed up in breathtaking attire. "Martha!" All 4 of the commanders yelled at the same time, recognizing an image of a half-fairy, half-human celebrity. She started out as a pirate, until one of the spaceships she was robbing belonged to an interstellar marketing agency, where one of the recruiters risked his life to get her to sign for one of clients as a model. From there her charm and natural charisma launched her career, and she became a celebrity in many star systems. The commanders, realizing they momentarily lost composure, quickly gathered themselves, until they also realized that the others had done the same. "Why did you say Martha?" one of them asked hesitantly. "Martha is my idol," declared one of the aliens, a humanoid, four-armed being with 6 thin eye slits on its face. "My daughter is obsessed with her," said another alien. The 4th, instead of saying anything, showed a tattoo of the name Martha over his heart. Just as the 4 commanders were suddenly considering what to do next, Audrey up on the screen said, "Follow us on our journey as we showcase and celebrate the best that our contestants have to offer, to compete for the final glory of being titled the first ever, Interstellar Lady Cosmos." "I'll spare your life today," said one alien, before immediately ordering a retreat back to the nearest city. Another 2 shouted some random excuse, while the 3rd one didn't even bother, and immediately ordered his soldiers to return to base and start a feast. He liked to eat something while he watched stuff. The show finally started. Lex watched for a few minutes, and also observed his inn. Currently, other than the contestants themselves, there were only 1 million observers. The early, relatively empty village now seemed somewhat full. Every park, every restaurant, every rooftop had small gatherings, and, Lex noticed, that a majority of his guests were some subspecies of humans. That was probably because most of his exposure so far had been with humans. Or were humans just that common in the universe? Time would tell. Naturally, to take care of 1 million guests, and probably more incoming, was not something a few thousand staff members could handle. But Lex was not ready to hire hundreds of thousands of permanent workers just yet. Fortunately, the event management panel gave him the option of temporary workers. For the price of 8 million MP, he hired 300,000 temporary workers, all of them at the peak of the body-tempering realm. They came highly trained, and seemed to be easily handling the pressure so far. He sighed, and then stopped paying attention to the festivities. He really didn't have the time. He had mastered quite a few arrays in the past month, but his deployment time was still low. He would focus on that for now. As for the Lady Cosmos pageant? With the number of participants they had, even if they aired 24 hours a day, every day, it would take quite a while for the preliminary round to end. Since the pageant was no longer primarily focusing on beauty, since with many different species involved judging beauty became more difficult, a great emphasis was placed on talent. The first portion would allow the participants to showcase their talents. Any participants who were mortals took on tasks such as playing instruments, playing sports, creating arts, etc., and would only be judged amongst themselves. They would not be pit against someone at the Foundation realm, who would most likely be using their cultivation as a part of showcasing their talents. If Lex had been watching, he would notice that one of the first participants being shown was a ballerina, and a familiar one at that. This ballerina had also performed once during the cultural part of the Midnight Games, before disappearing. Since then, not only had the poise and technique of the ballerina improved immensely, but so had her ethereal beauty. Even non-humans, who had completely different criteria for beauty, could not help but be attracted to her performance. But, as moving as her performance was, it was one out of over a million. When the participant disappeared from the inn after her single performance, almost no one seemed to notice. Almost because Anita, who had a detailed record of everything that happened during the Midnight Games, was also currently recording everything happening at the pageant, immediately picked up on the detail, as well as the pattern of disappearance. It was also at this point that someone tried to harass one of the participants who was waiting her turn. A slim and greasy fellow tried to slip his hand over the small of the contestant's back and pull her close. The girl yelped and moved away, for she had not been expecting to suddenly be grabbed. "Oh, come on, dear, I was only dashed." The man never got to finish his words. The delinquent viper vine burst from the ground and tightly wrapped itself around the man. The commotion attracted a lot of attention, and by the time people began to look, the man was being held upside down in the air, 100 feet, 30 meters, in the air. The man continued to hang in the air until the current participant showcasing her talent finished, at which point instead of the next contestant, the screen turned to a projection of the man. The dragon, which had up until now kept its distance from the crowds, flew up into the air, its wings spreading strong gusts of wind threatening to topple over anyone nearby. "This is the first and only warning," the dragon said in a deeply terrifying, grunt-led voice. "On orders of the innkeeper, anyone who targets a guest of the inn in any way will be treated as an enemy of the inn." The appearance of a dragon on the show was nearly enough to shock anyone watching, but the fact that the dragon took orders from someone was about to rock several worlds. Lex had planned this little performance early on, anticipating someone trying to take advantage of the numerous girls. His aim had been to dissuade any troublemakers. While he did achieve that, what he did not expect was that the viewership of the show was about to explode, along with the popularity of the inn. Try. The man tried to speak with a trembling voice, but before he could finish, he disappeared. He had been kicked out of the inn, but none of the viewers knew that. Instead of horrified, they were enamored. Strong, decisive, cruel. These were the things people loved. Well, at least the people on the planets the pirates had spread the inn's keys to. At the same time, many people who were hiding from various threats or enemies suddenly gained a new destination to run towards. With such a dramatic start, the Lady Cosmos show was kicked off. Ragnar too was shown a recording of the scene where the dragon made an appearance, and suddenly raised an eyebrow. First a celestial, and now a dragon? The innkeeper really knew how to pick his guards. He was tempted to go see the dragon firsthand, but now that he was on his way to a battlefield, his every move was likely being monitored. He did not want it to seem like he paid too much attention to the inn, so he dismissed the video. Back at the inn, Xian, the Drake refiner who was vacationing at the inn, had just come out of his room after a several weeks-long nap, and was dumbstruck. A real dragon? And it seemed to be working for the inn. Suddenly, he ran at his fastest speed to search for Gerard, the only person he really knew at the inn. He had to get a job at the inn. He absolutely had to. Chapter 295, How Fancy. Baron, cover me, yelled a woman who leaped into the air and fell behind her cohorts, her focus already on another task she was completing. As it happened, she landed furthest back at the group, directly behind Jovi, the synergist, and Lex, the all-around survival expert of the group. The group was locked in combat, fighting against a pack of Raylas. Raylas were actually parasites that often took over hosts' bodies and used them to fight, most commonly affecting slimes. In exchange for completely destroying the body in a short time, they would be able to exert power countless times more than the actual strength of the original body's owner. The pack they were facing had, as usual, taken over slimes, but that did not mean that they were weak. On the contrary, every drop of a slime's body was energy-rich, making the Raylas particularly formidable. Baron, one of the main combatants of the group, moved to intercept the Raylas' attack, but missed it by mere centimeters. He could not be blamed, for the orange beam moved at inhuman speeds and with devastating strength. The target of the attack remained Sohee, the girl who had yelled, but since she had fallen back, and the attack seemed to have adjusted to follow her direction, it lined up perfectly to hit Lex instead. Too quick to block, or even yell out a warning, the group could only watch as the beam struck Lex. It wasn't like Lex was a weakling, or that he couldn't fight, but that his role in the group was as a safety and survival advisor, and had proved himself capable in that regard. As for fighting, it was generally understood that combatants were better trained and stronger than non-combatants, so in a situation where Lex suffered a surprise attack, they expected him to be gravely injured. When the group recovered from the bright flash of light and looked towards Lex to investigate the degree of Lex's injury, they were surprised to find him unharmed. He remained standing in the same spot, a rather bored look on his face and not a single ruffle on his clothes, with his left hand extended out and his palm stretched out, as if to block the attack with his bare hands. In truth, he had employed the technique talk to the hand, but since the barrier erected was invisible, no one noticed. It truly did seem like he blocked the attack with his bare head. "Don't get distracted, keep blocking," Lex said, breaking the group from their reverie. His tone was instructive, as if he was still continuing his job as a safety advisor. Too busy to feel embarrassed, the group continued to defend, while Lex continued to stand there, putting his hands in his pockets as he observed the fight. Quenhild had already informed him that he was not expected to fight, and each member of this group was as elite as they got, which is why he did not really feel bad about not helping out. A short while later, Sohee, the girl taking cover behind Lex, finally finished her task. Her hair turned purple and her pupils took on a lilac hue. She took in a deep breath and, after looking towards the main group of Raylas, shrieked. As if the sound of her scream had become visible, purple zigzagging streaks ran through the air, doing no harm to her allies, but directly crushing the parasites inside the slime bodies. A few still survived, but having lost their numerical advantage, they were quickly crushed. As soon as the fight finished, the group gathered around Quenhild, who had been silently observing the fight from the side. By now, Lex had learned a number of things about her. First of all, she was not at all as amicable as she usually was with him. No, she was extremely decisive and firm, and took great pleasure in bending others to her will. That did not, however, mean that she was arrogant or incompetent. In fact, she was quite capable, which is where the issue actually originated from. She assumed, rightfully most of the time, that others could not match up to the standards she held for herself, and so gave little to no importance to their opinions. After all, their perspectives on any issue would end up being vastly different. Most would look up to something as an achievement to something she would consider a failure. Secondly, he had finally heard about her dropping her name, as well as the statement she gave when doing it. It was quite unfortunate, but Lex could now determine that she did not at all believe his story about not being a child of the king's, and instead felt that both of them were in the same boat. He also learned about why their party was only 12 people instead of more. Yes, this party was made up of the elite, but even if Quenhild was limited to only Foundation realm cultivators, there was no need to stop at 12. The reason was since she publicly dropped her name, certain people had started targeting her as a form of punishment for her arrogance. No one would have the gall to actually harm her, since the presence or absence of a name did not change her lineage, but many could not swallow the insult to the king her actions had wrought. Fortunately, no one knew her actions were prompted by his hypothetical advice, or he would have attracted a whole host of trouble for himself as well. The members of her party, or at least the two that were targeting him, did have some suspicions about him though. They assumed that Lex was trying to win her heart, which is why they wanted to remove him. Initially, Lex was ready to retaliate lethally if her two followers dared try anything over the line. Now, however, he could not see them as any more than little kids fighting over a crush. Good job on the block, Lex. After this group session, I'll have to have your defenses tested. If they're adequate, you can serve the perfect role as Sohi's defender while she readies her spells. Sohi, the girl who yelled, was a witch, meaning she had a special profession that made use of spiritual energy and soul energy, combined. Indeed, she was a dual cultivator. In fact, everyone in Quenhild's party other than Lex was a dual cultivator, hence their status as the elite. It was nothing. I always anticipate Baron's incompetence, Lex replied casually. Baron, one of the two guys who always tried to pick on Lex, glared at him, but he dared not say anything in front of Quenhild. It was not just her temper that was scary, but her strength as well. Sohi, good job with your spell. Jovi, if you'd been faster with augmenting Baron's speed, he wouldn't have missed that block. The rest of you, good job, you've been performing excellently. Tomorrow we'll take a rest, and instead of practicing, I'll be providing all of you with your gear. Day after tomorrow, as you know, the minor realms open. We'll be facing the real deal, and the fights won't be as tame as the ones we've been having. A rare compliment invigorated many of the group members, but Lex had diverted his attention towards the inn while Quenhild spoke. He was not paying attention to the pageant, or the many guests, but instead his attention was on Midnight Mountain. Delma was sitting opposite to the dragon and, drinking tea? No, it was boba tea. As long as he was paying attention, the dragon did no more than grunt, but Velma was not at all bothered by the dragon's dismissive attitude and kept regaling it with tales from different worlds. As if that was not odd enough. Gerard was bringing with him, pulled by the strength of his upgraded golf cart, a 30-foot-long teacup up the mountain. Were they about to offer the dragon tea? Where did they get the massive cup from? Oh, it was a standard cup for massive guests, Mary informed him. Once the empty cup was in place, Velma put a ladder against the cup and climbed, all the while holding an ordinary-sized tea kettle and continuing her story. When she reached the top, she tilted the kettle to pour, and a thin, unending stream of tea came out, filling the cup with unusual speed. After he recovered from the shock of what was happening, he felt proud. Yes, this was the inn. Why should his workers feel intimidated by dragons, or extend less courtesy? Once the cup was filled, and Velma climbed down, the dragon finally opened an eye and looked at the little human girl. She looked like a teenager, barely 16, but her eyes contained only an innocent curiosity, and were distinctly lacking fear. After a moment, it extended one of its limbs, and picked up the cup. Lex could not help but notice the pinky equivalent of its claw extended as it took a sip. How fancy! Chapter 296, Condottiere. After taking a big, deep gulp, the dragon blew out steam through its nose, and its scales vibrated. That feels so good, I was absolutely parched, the dragon said, its voice changing drastically from the previous grumble to a surprisingly cute one, that too with a perfectly polished British accent. Lex was standing perfectly still when he heard it, but still nearly fell over. It's been a long time since someone has offered me tea. Not since back in the early days, when the condottiere would have a lot more time. How long it has been. Condottiere? Your leader? Velma asked, positively beaming with excitement and curiosity. At this point, Lex stopped paying attention, leaving Velma to continue her gossip, for Quenhild was done with her remarks and they were once again about to begin practice. The timing was a shame. A few more moments, and Lex would have heard the dragon's next remarks. Leader? No, more like the owner. The condottiere is the owner of the largest mercenary group in the universe. Where trouble brews, and there is gold to be made, the reaving dread shall send forth its armies. Well, based on how much gold the client pays. The dragon took another sip of the tea, quite pleased with itself. Velma did not care much for that news, since she worked at the best hotel in the universe. And weren't the mercenaries working for their hotel? That meant the hierarchy was clearly established, the innkeeper was better than the condottiere. She was more curious about other things. Like, do dragons date? And do they have a type? Back in the crystal realm, Lex spent the next day training, as promised, followed by Quenhild privately testing out Lex's defense. He was not one to brag, but when a girl asked for a show, well, Lex put on a show. In the end, without having to use any ridiculous weapons, Quenhild wasn't even able to break through talk to the hand. To be fair, the technique built a defense proportional to Lex's own. As it was, a Foundation realm cultivator would have to really put in some effort to hurt Lex, and so the defensive ability of the technique was remarkable, to say the least. He did not have the heart to tell her that he still had the ripple shell, another powerful defensive technique waiting for anyone who broke through talk to the hand. And, should someone finally succeed in breaking both, every millimeter of his flesh has the same defensive capability. But while he still had these techniques in reserve, he didn't doubt that Quenhild, a body and spirit cultivator, didn't have secret techniques of her own that would deliver awesome power. The next day, as promised, Quenhild outfitted her entire group personally. That was to say, each member received personalized equipment that would strengthen their strongest aspects and make up for their weaknesses. But while everyone received live, maneuverable armor, Lex got a solid metal, sleeveless vest. Not only was it incredibly heavy, actually almost causing Lex's knees to buckle, it had abs engraved right onto the armor. It felt like he was walking around shirtless. According to Quenhild, his defense was so ridiculous that trying to run or dodge was a waste of his efforts, and he should just continue to increase his defense further, even at the expense of movement speed. Everyone received a similar helmet that would protect them from soul tracks and physical tracks, but also let Quenhild communicate with all of them simultaneously. Next, Lex received a massive, round shield, and a single-handed sword. While the rest were getting fancy weapons, guns, and even a self-aiming minigun attachable to a wrist, Lex looked like a Spartan knockoff from a cheap play. If there was any consolation, it was that Lex's vambraces had an enchantment that would aid him in drawing arrays. Also, they were extremely durable and further improved Lex's defense. He was so well protected, a turtle would shy away in shame. The remainder of the day was free, so Lex said his farewell to Amelia before spending a few hours checking up on the inn. They were still continuing with the preliminary round. With over 1 million participants in the first round, it was bound to take time. Finally, he went to Quenhild's apartment at night. The entire group was gathered there, as they had planned to venture off together. Lex was expecting that the next day there would be some kind of ceremony as well as inauguration. Technically, there would be. But certain elite and privileged students were given an unwritten privilege. The minor realms were officially opened at midnight, under the bright light of the ever-present soul birds, and before a majority of participants even knew of it, Quenhild and her group entered a minor realm. A teacher had especially come to open the entrance right inside her apartment. The opening to the minor realm was unusual. It was not dark, nor was it vague. It felt like there was a window, and Lex could look right into the minor realm. But at the same time, looking at the entrance hurt Lex's eye, and his brain could not actually absorb the image of the realm beyond. Passing through the opening, which Lex did with steady steps, felt even weirder. It was like Lex suddenly became aware of the sensation of phantom pain, but instead of feeling pain in some missing limb, he felt it in an entire phantom body that was connected to his consciousness, but not his actual body. But, the next second, the phantom body and actual body switched places, while his consciousness remained absolutely centered between the two. The next moment, the strangeness receded, and Lex found himself standing knee-deep in a bog. The water was warm, and bubbles were releasing some kind of green gas. There was no soul bird in the sky, nor any celestial body. Instead, a light blue light seemed to be emanating from a mountain range in the distance. As peaceful as the light seemed, there was an urgent matter that required his attention. Neither the warm water nor the strange gas did anything to Lex, but he knew instinctively that it was not good for his companions. "Activate your isolation talismans, the air is poisonous," Lex said out loud, warning the rest of the group. They didn't hesitate, not only because of how weird the air looked, but because Lex had proven his survival skills to them. More than once during training, he had made excellent calls and had earned the group's trust. Or at least, Quenhild's. Other than just armor and weapons, they had also been gifted with the best survival equipment and gear. It may seem like Quenhild was being extremely generous, but none of what she gave them could compare to a single corner of a minor realm. "So how do we take control of this minor realm?" Lex finally asked the big question. It wasn't like he hadn't asked before, but all the answers he would receive in the end were that it would be different for each realm. "Jovi, scan the area. Baron, look for a temporary base rest point. Ness, stop drinking that water. Patrick, ready the beacon." Instead of directly answering Lex, Quenhild first gave out a few different orders. Before they did anything, they needed to get their bearing, and preferably step out of the bog, though no dry area seemed to be in sight at the moment. Finally, she turned to Lex. Each of these realms was discovered by the Academy, but none of them were naturally made. No one knows how old the Crystal Realm is, other than perhaps the Crystal Race. The history, the heritage, possibly even the key to defeating the Craven could be in any of these realms, which is the real reason the Academy has us explore them. But, it's not like they're sending us to unknown realms. They can estimate the relative level of each realm, which is why we have the chance to take control of this realm. As for how we do it, I don't know yet. Once Patrick can deploy the beacon, it will collect information about this realm and I'll... Enemies. Lex interrupted her, suddenly looking in a different direction. There are hundreds of them, they're traversing underwater, and they're strong. We need to run, they're coming our way. Quenhild didn't doubt him for even a moment, despite the fact that she could not see these enemies and there seemed to be no indication of them yet. The group started running, and after using Heart's marathon, even Lex was able to keep up despite his heavy armor. Barely. But, despite their attempts at escape, the pursuers seemed to be catching up, and soon everyone was able to sense something swimming through the murky water in the distance behind them. Mr. Innkeeper, an innocent voice, spoke in his mind. "There's a lot of energy in this realm, but something seems to be eating it. You should get to it quickly, or there might be none left." Chapter 297, Too Easy. What direction? Lex asked the Lotus in his mind. In the distance, where the light from behind the mountain is coming from. Lex nodded and approached Quenhild. "Quen, I'm not sure if this helps with taking control of the minor realm, but there's a massive energy source in the direction of those mountains." Quenhild was genuinely surprised at the information that Lex provided, for those mountains were miles away and it should have been impossible for any of them to detect something so far away unaided. Regardless, she still could not determine if what they were searching for was there, but it was a good guess. "Jovi, any day now," Quenhild yelled with a hint of impatience in her voice while she looked at the man. An inexperienced person may look at the members of her group and assume that Jovi was one of the weakest and most useless members, whereas that was far from the truth. Jovi was a synergist, a profession adopted by those who dual cultivated the soul and spirit paths. Due to his extreme sensitivity towards life as well as energy, he was able to greatly bolster his allies. Based on his strength and skill, he could even directly double someone's strength. "Give me a moment, done," the exasperated Jovi yelled, before his body started to emit a yellow light, enveloping the group. The moment Lex felt the subtle warmth of the light fall on him, he felt his speed pick up drastically. The entire group's strength had increased, and they changed their direction towards the mountains. Running in a bog was frustrating to say the least, and while their combined teamwork should have allowed them to fight off most enemies, there was no point in wasting their energy doing so. After all, it had to be remembered that while they entered the realm early, others would also enter in a few hours. While a majority of them would simply be hunting for anything valuable, some may also have the same objective. It would be best to take the greatest advantage of their head start. "Tim, do your things," Quenhild yelled, and the tall man nodded and stopped running, getting left behind. No one questioned it, for they were all familiar with Tim. He was a body and spirit cultivator, and though he did not have a unique profession to set him apart, he had a strong bloodline that made him a demolition expert, as well as extremely capable in setting up traps. A few minutes later he caught up, looking slightly pale. But his face showed only a satisfied expression, and only a few moments later, when an earth-shaking explosion took place, his smile grew wider. Whatever had been following them stopped after that, and the group encountered a massive boulder, jutting out of the ground, giving them a dry place to rest for a while. Not that any of them other than Tim needed a rest. The real reason they stopped was so that Patrick, a soul and spirit cultivator, could scan the realm using a special beacon. Looking at this group might cause one to begin doubting the rarity of dual cultivators, but it had to be remembered that even to be qualified to have Quenhild consider them, they had to be the best in their respective fields. It would not be an exaggeration to say that they were each one out of a million. In fact, it was probably an underestimation. Regardless, what set Patrick apart was his unusual cultivation technique. For various, complex reasons, all originating from that technique, he had developed his spiritual sense prior to the Golden Core realm. In exchange, until he reached the Golden Core realm, his body would be very frail, and could not take strenuous exertion. But the advantage that he gained in reconnaissance abilities, with the help of various equipment, was too great to give up. The rest took this time to check their equipment and keep an eye out for any more trouble. Lex similarly remained vigilant. There was no doubt that his instincts would warn him should any danger approach, but that did not mean he should become complacent. His own experiences were enough to let him know that there were always exceptions to anything you might think is a concrete rule. A few times, he sensed some creatures approach them beneath the murky water. But each time, after sensing the strength and vigilance of his group, the creatures would retreat. He had not yet actually seen what form the creatures in this realm actually were. The fact that they hid in the water so far may be one reason, but considering the only light source in this minor realm was very dim, he may as well have missed a few creatures passing by in the distance. "The scan is complete," Patrick said after some time, attracting the attention of the group. "The approximate size of this realm is around 100,000 acres, though with areas that large it becomes difficult to get an accurate guess. There are several, distinct biomes all beside one another. More importantly, there seem to be signs of large ruins in many areas, all of which may contain valuable treasures, or perhaps records about the origin of this realm. There's a lot of interference around the mountains, so I can't get a detailed reading, but I can vaguely detect large structures there as well. There's a good possibility that the largest, or perhaps most intact ruins are there." Quenhild considered the possibilities for a moment, then had Patrick chart out a path for them towards the mountain while exploring any nearby ruins. With slight detours, they would be able to fit 2 different ruins on their journey. "There we go, we already know what to do. This conquering minor realm stuff is a lot easier than you said it would be," said one of the group members called Ness. Lex's lip twitched as he looked at the girl raising death flags. Ness was not the brightest person Lex had ever met. Even trying to be reserved with his judgment, she could only be called dumb. In fact, when they arrived at this realm, Quenhild had to stop her from drinking the murky bog water from which the poisonous gas was being released. But, for everything she lacked, she was perhaps the most dangerous person Lex had seen at the Foundation realm. To be fair, he had yet to see Quenhild fight seriously. But Ness, who followed the body path and a rare and dangerous path called Tino, which was also actually a form of the body path, was extremely fast, strong and vicious. He just hoped that her strength would help her combat the endless death flags she was raising, for even as they left the boulder and headed towards the first ruins, she kept emphasizing how boring this was turning out to be. After an hour more of jogging, Lex couldn't help but admit that the journey had, indeed, so far been much easier than anticipated. Maybe visiting multiple realms and absorbing energy won't be such an ordeal after all. No sooner had Lex completed the thought that the ground erupted from beneath them, with no forewarning whatsoever. By the time Lex's instincts kicked in, he was already flying through the air, a sharp stone-like spear stuck in a large dent in his armor. In the air, with no sense of what was happening to the rest, he quickly pulled his legs up to his chest, just in time to dodge another rock spear. Despite the surprise attack, Lex wasn't at all injured. This wasn't a result of his sturdiness, but rather of his preparations. He had used Ripple Shell, a defensive technique that covered his body the moment he entered the minor realm. The best part was that the technique would stay active until disabled or defeated. When Lex finally landed, he quickly leaped aside, in case anyone was attacking his landing spot, and took note of the situation. The enemy was, it looked like some kind of sentient rock that could manipulate the minerals in the ground around it. He took note of the clothes and found that Jovi, so he, and Patrick were hurt, with Patrick in the worst condition. Without wasting a moment, he employed Heart's Marathon to boost his speed and sprinted right into the fray. With the element of surprise lost, and with his instincts fully working, he dodged each of the stone spears launched his way with ease. Without a thought for attacking the rock, he grabbed all the injured and promptly retreated from the fight. This was not cowardice, but the simple fact that if he attacked, he would interfere with the coordinated attack the rest were performing. In any given situation, he would first follow his training, and only take the initiative to make different decisions should a drastic change occur. Just as he retreated from the combat zone, and set the three down, the ground behind him burst once again, and a barrage of stone spears flew at him. Chapter 298 Irony. A cloud of dust and smoke closely followed the eruption of the ground, which, along with the already low visibility, made it impossible to see. "Damn," exclaimed Quenhild as she dashed into the dust cloud. She had no doubt that Lex would survive even if he was taken by surprise, but the other three might not. She used a seemingly simple palm attack in the air, causing a gust of wind to clear the cloud, revealing Lex heroically blocking the stone spears from attacking the three behind him. If it had just been a single stone attacking him, or even multiple attacking from the same direction, he could have gotten by with using Talk to the Hand. But three different sentient stones seemed to be attacking him from various directions, causing him to run around, blocking each attack with his shield. The three injured members weren't just sitting idly by either. Jovi had Patrick on his back and was trying to build some distance, while Sohi prepared a spell to attack, her attention completely diverted, leaving her vulnerable. Upon learning the situation was under control, Quenhild diverted her momentum and attacked one of the sentient stones. Were this a normal stone, her single attack would have pulverized it, but on this rock it only spread a few cracks. The rocks had no mouths so they could not scream, but the spirit energy surrounding them vibrated violently, causing everyone to be hit by a wave of dizziness. So he, however, was able to finish her spell in time. A dome of purple light formed around the three sentient stones, blocking their attacks while simultaneously attacking their souls. The spirit energy in the air began to vibrate even more frenziedly, giving birth to the illusion of shrieking. Just as Sohi was about to sigh in relief, the ground started cracking, revealing more and more stones. "We need to regroup," yelled Lex to Quenhild. "I can't tell how many there are, but even as is, we're surrounded." Even Lex could only block attacks from a single direction at a time, and with them being surrounded and outnumbered, they would need to work together. "Leave it to me," yelled Patrick and clapped his hands together. An invisible, yet strangely tangible ripple traveled through the air, originating from his clap, slowing down the rock's attacks. He did not need to explain what he had done, for all the team members knew each other's abilities. The rocks did not have eyes, and while no one could tell exactly how they perceived the world around them, there was a good chance that their perception was based on spiritual energy, similar to the way spiritual sense was derived from spiritual energy. Patrick's clap could create energy ripples within a small radius, effectively weakening all spiritual perception abilities. It was originally designed to work against scouts, but for creatures solely dependent on such abilities, the ripple was even more effective. Taking advantage of the short interruption, Lex and the others regrouped, though there seemed to be no hope of escaping. More and more rocks were revealing themselves, already increasing the numbers to over a dozen, and during the brief clashes they were not able to kill any of the rocks. "Can you tell why you aren't able to sense them?" Quenhild asked Lex. This was the first time Lex hadn't been able to foretell an attack, and they needed to understand if this was a unique circumstance or something that could be replicated. "Pretty much. I didn't sense anything, because this wasn't a trap. These rocks just happened to be in the ground we were covering. Even so, if they had been asleep, I would still have been able to sense the danger. It's more like they were in some kind of stasis that made them no different from ordinary rocks in the ground." Quenhild nodded, understanding the limits of Lex's ability, and moved on to the next matter. "The situation is serious, but not impossibly so. Form a circle, and coordinate on the attack. Ness, you take lead on the attack and the rest will support you. I'll cover the ground so that it doesn't erupt under us," Lex added. "But the range is only about 10 feet, so stay close." Lex's defensive technique, talk to the hand, was originally designed only to be used from the hands. However, for Lex, who mastered the technique with a depth that may have even surpassed the creator of the technique, making small alterations to use it from his feet was no issue. The three injured gathered in the center of the circle, all the while activating their abilities to support the team. Sylvia, another one of the group members, a body and soul cultivator, began healing them while the rest focused on attacking and defending. Having collected themselves, and working together once again, their lethality shot through the roof. Ness was a human torpedo, shooting through the distance that separated herself and the target, leaving only destruction in her wake. Tim was using his bloodline to boost the explosiveness of her attacks, while Jovi was increasing her speed. Patrick kept causing ripples to distract the rocks, while the rest either intercepted attacks aimed towards Ness or protected their circle. The tides changed like a flip of a switch, and the number of rocks finally started decreasing instead of increasing. In just a few seconds, when she managed to destroy 5 of the rocks, even the rocks changed their strategies. Instead of endlessly barraging the circle with stone spears, the rocks rolled towards one another. The rocks attached themselves to one another with practiced precision, and in a moment, they went from being numerous individual sentient rocks to one massive, humanoid monster made of many small rocks. Ironically, though, the shift made it even easier for them to destroy the newly formed rock monster. The only reason they were disadvantaged to begin with was the overwhelming numbers, attacking them from different angles. With that advantage lost, it did not matter at all that the rock monster was stronger in this form. After all, their group was not lacking in strength. "Investigate the rocks, see if there is anything of value. If not, we'll move from here before taking a rest once we put some distance between this place and us," said Quenhild. Since Patrick was best at investigation, he scanned the rocks and discovered these rocks were not normal. They could serve as valuable crafting or forging material, but unfortunately that was as far as their speciality went. The rocks were too heavy to take along, and after they grabbed a small memento of the fight, the group sprinted away, this time more vigilant. As it turned out, the prudence was well founded, for only a few minutes after they left, many strange creatures had been attracted by the sound of fighting. Finding nothing other than the corpses of the rock monsters, the creatures dispersed. Some who were interested in the corpses fought with one another. Yet none of that had anything to do with Lex's group. They ran all the way to the entrance of a forest and, after scouting for a bit, found a secluded area to rest in. They weren't tired enough to warrant rest, but if the 3 injured members of the group weren't adequately healed, they would not be able to keep up with the group. All in all, they had performed well, considering this was their first actual encounter as a group, but the three who were injured couldn't help but feel embarrassed. After all that training, they had been the first to falter. Of course, there were two other people who were feeling something else entirely. Baron and Nick, the two who had been targeting Lex, stared at him with disgust. In their opinion, Lex was entire incompetent, and had proved as much by the fact that he hadn't warned them about the attack. One could argue that detecting enemies wasn't what Lex was brought on board for in the first place, so a misstep in this regard mattered little. After all, every warning he gave them benefited them greatly, and was a bonus on the fact he was supposed to advise them on survival. It was just that, he had been so good and so consistent with it that this little matter had slipped their minds. Once the three were finally healed, or rather healed enough, the group continued their journey. As they were running in a forest now, they encountered more beasts, but fortunately Lex was able to warn them with ample time, allowing them to overcome the ordeal smoothly. A few hours later, they finally reached the first ruin, and the moment they laid eyes on the ancient structure, everyone other than Lex gasped in excitement. A moment later though, Lex caught on as well. These were no ordinary buildings, their design, their material, even the size of them, they all signified who the inhabitants of these buildings had once been. The Crystal Race. Chapter 299. An interesting guest. It would not require a genius to realize the value this realm held if it used to belong to the Crystal Race. After all, they were the strongest race around. Furthermore, in the long history of the Crystal Realm, it would be unrealistic to say that the Crystal Race had never suffered any defeat, or given up any realms. But, while suffering defeat was a possibility, it was much, much rarer for the Crystal Race for several reasons. To fully explain the reasoning, a comparison between a settlement of the Crystal Race and the human race can be made. The first and foremost challenge of a human settlement would come from a hostile environment. The time required for a newborn human to even embark upon the cultivation road was 15 years, and so it was reasonable to say that on average, at least 20 years were required for humans to train a basic soldier from birth. If, during this time, a human settlement faced too many losses or deaths from hostile forces, the settlement would then become vulnerable. In contrast, a newborn from the Crystal Race was born with the power level equivalent to a human golden core cultivator. Even if at birth they could not contribute to security, just by existing, the Crystal Race had a higher threshold for the danger they could tolerate. The second challenge a settlement would face would be transmitting knowledge or skills. For example, a carpenter, no matter how good, is limited in how much they can work. More would have to be trained just to maintain the minimum requirements of a settlement, and regardless of field, the process was a long and tedious one. The Crystal Race, however, had a much faster way of transmitting information, in which they could imbue their experiences to those who wanted to learn. While skill would still require training and effort, the learning period was drastically reduced this way. This not only allowed them to retain their settlement, but also easily expand if needed. Lastly, one of the greatest challenges every settlement would face was the inevitable march of time, and the changes it brought. Leaders would die, buildings would collapse, policies would become outdated, and so much more. If each successive generation of that settlement did not rise to the challenges of their times, a single lifetime was enough to destroy even the sturdiest of foundations. But for the Crystal Race, while time brought its own challenges, the one thing it did not bring was old age and deterioration. This was because every member of the Crystal Race, regardless of age or cultivation, was born immortal. This was not to say that they never got sick or could not be killed. Rather, it just meant that the declines that humans faced after they passed their prime was something the Crystal Race would never encounter. This meant that they would forever retain their great leaders, their best doctors, their legendary crafters, and since each of them had all but infinity to master their crafts, their standard 4 legendary was something the other races considered myths. So now, looking at the ruins of what must have been some kind of Crystal Race settlement, the entire group could not help but wonder what had happened here. "Can you sense anything?" Quenhild asked Patrick, who was already scanning the buildings using his beacon. "There are many energy signatures in the buildings, but they're not living. Which means there are either items or treasures of very high value in there or, the most likely scenario, is that the buildings still have some functioning formations. Scout the area. I want to know if any beasts have made this their territory before going inside. Most of the group waited while Patrick and Cindy, the tracking expert, a body and spirit cultivator, went out to scout the area. When they returned, they brought back predictable news. The ruins had become the nest for a large predator, the bloody jit. It was a flightless bird, not because it lacked wings, but because its body was so massive, its wings could not support its weight. It was extremely deadly, ridiculously strong, and had the ferocity of a tornado, so naturally the first order of business was killing the bird. This is where all their training began to shine, and as soon as Patrick provided the group with a map of the ruins and the surrounding terrain, they began planning the fight. One would expect that in a battle like this, Lex would serve as the bait to bring the beast to an ambush spot. But no, he had a different job, one that would finally allow him to put his arrays to use. Once the creature was lured to wherever the group wanted to fight, and the combatants began fighting, they would have to ensure that the beast did not escape once the tide of the battle turned against it. Essentially, he would have to create an inescapable cage. For requests of this level, Lex would have to rely on the book he had gotten from John. The author had recorded a number of excellent arrays, seemingly for any scenario, and now Lex would put them to use. But, as he was still a beginner, it would take him well over an hour to create such an array. Fortunately, preparing to fight the bloody jit would also take time. The group began working. Planet Aram, Jotun Empire territory. This planet, which was several times larger than Jupiter, was one of the most popular tourist spots in all of Jotun territory. Such a claim was no small matter, as it was not just considering a single galaxy, but all the galaxies under Jotun rule. The reason for that was not only the fact that this planet was abundant in every kind of resource, rich in beauty, absolutely secure, as well as a hub for commerce on an interstellar scale, but because this planet was the private property of one of the most noble families in the Jotun Empire. The Jotun Empire, along with its royal family, had several noble families as well, all with varying levels of importance. Of those families, there were 3 ranked directly below the royal family, in both prestige and power. Each family had their own speciality, but in such a utilitarian universe, absolute power was the most important factor in deciding a family's worth. The intricacies of the Jotun societal system were complex, and the standings of the noble families even more so. However, all complexities aside, no matter what, it was absolutely unusual that a member of such a family was running in such panic, on his own planet no less. The 19-year-old golden core cultivator looked nothing like a scion as he ran through the empty, but usually crowded fruit farm. There was no one chasing him. In fact, this entire region of the planet seemed to be devoid of any people beside the running boy. But the lack of pursuers did not suit the boy. At this point, he was running on fumes, as not only had he been awake for several days, he had already overdrawn his spiritual energy. In a few minutes at most, he would collapse. As if aware of this, whoever was after the boy made no effort to close the distance. They were content to watch and wait. "Where is it? Where is it?" he mumbled to himself, his mind on the brink of collapse. Just as he was losing hope, the bracelet on his wrist vibrated and the boy's eyes widened in joy. With no energy left to put on a performance, he did not hide his actions as he suddenly stopped and started digging in the ground. As if sensing something unusual about his actions, hundreds of figures suddenly appeared in the farm, all of them hooded, ethereal figures. But their arrogance had cost them. The boy suddenly dug up a small container and smashed it open, revealing a golden key and a letter. Not wasting any time, he grabbed the letter and crushed the key, disappearing in a golden light mere moments before the nearest hooded figure reached his spot. "I've lost his trace," the hooded figure said, devoid of all emotions. As if that was all they needed to hear, the remaining figures vanished into thin air, as if they had never been there. As soon as the boy arrived at the inn, he fell to his knees, fighting to keep his consciousness. He didn't know where he was, or if it was safe. As if sensing his distress, a hologram of a human appeared in front of him and informed him that he was at the Midnight Inn, and that he was absolutely safe. Help was already on the way to give him medical aid. Upon hearing that, the boy smiled, and allowed himself to lose consciousness. After all, he, Noman but, was born with a very special power. No one or thing in the universe, regardless of their cultivation level, could lie to him without him finding out. The hologram had not lied when it introduced the inn, and so he knew he was safe. For now. Chapter 300 Arrogance or Confidence? Some time later, Noman woke up in the recovery room. He wasn't in the recovery pod for he hadn't actually suffered any grave injuries, just severe exhaustion. It was not something that would recover quickly, and he would be in a weakened state for weeks if not months to come. However, it did seem like the recovery room had a positive effect on him, so maybe that time could be cut short. He was in a private room, so he was alone, which allowed him to relax a little. The letter he brought alongside him was on a table beside him, so he tore it open to read. The message it conveyed was short and simple. Stay at the inn as long as you can, it will be able to hide your trace. Adopt a false identity, and only leave the inn once you're able to block all forms of scrying or prophecy. Your helper in the dark. Noman grimaced when he read the letter. His ability to detect truth was not as simple as it seemed. Regardless of the medium, his ability would stay active. This meant that, even just by reading this letter, he could tell whoever wrote this letter was telling the truth. Furthermore, it was not so easy to use technicalities to mislead him. If a person told a truth, but with the intention of providing a false perception, then Noman's ability would detect that as a lie as well. This was an ability he had since birth, and though he did not understand it completely when he was a child, since the moment he realized what it was, he had kept this ability secret. He was not an heir, or some high-ranking member of the Butt family, but even just as a regular member, the exposure he had was beyond what others could comprehend. As such, he never even told his parents, or the seniors in his family, about this ability, for more than once he heard the seniors lie. Of course, detecting a lie did not mean he would automatically learn the truth, but sometimes, just knowing falsehood was enough. After all, he had seen many speeches made by prominent politicians and nobles, some even from the royal family, and would immediately know when they were lying. People would kill him to keep their secrets, and others would kill just to get their hands on his ability. All in all, he just wanted to pretend to be a regular boy from a big family. But it was not meant to be. Some time ago, he received a letter from the mysterious helper in the dark claiming that, using some kind of oracle, a certain organization had learnt the truth of his ability and was coming to kidnap him for their own purposes. Since then, his life had turned upside down. Infiltrating his family's planet was already a big deal, but somehow isolating him from everyone, and blocking off anyone else from approaching, took power and influence he could not even imagine. At the very least, they hadn't been blatant about their motives, which meant they were still wary of his family. He considered just informing his family of his secret as well, but he knew that would lead to a life of being a puppet, which was not something he wanted. He closed his eyes and went back to sleep. When he was feeling a little better, he would go investigate this inn. At least they were nice enough to not ask him for money before treating him. But how was he supposed to know that the inn had directly sent the invoice to his family, who had paid without bothering to investigate what it was for? Lex stood calmly out in an open field, his mind wandering. He had already finished the array, and all that was needed now was to wait for the bloody jit to enter the trap so he could finally activate it. Until he did that, he could not move away. Eventually, the beast was lured here. He heard it before he saw it, the sharp screeching of a furious bird accompanied by the dull sound of earth being ripped apart, like a massive till cutting through the land. When it came into sight, to his surprise, Lex found that the bird simply looked like an eagle, just expanded to about 50 feet, 15 meters. Its body was pressed directly against the ground, and Lex didn't blame it, for he doubted its leg would be able to carry the weight of its massive body. Instead, it was using its wings to pull itself forward, like a baby just learning to crawl. Despite the odd nature in which it moved, it was not slow at all. It moved like a train, hurling anything in its path away. It was chasing after Baron originally, but something about the way Lex stood in the open, casually, looking at it as if watching a show, greatly antagonized it. Letting loose another deafening screech, it changed its target to Lex. Yet still, even as its hulking figure bore down towards Lex, he did not so much as flinch. The calm in his eyes was more deafening than any screech, and his stationary figure more arrogant than any beast. The bloody Jit was looking forward to crushing the puny human, but it was not meant to be. Just as the Jit was a few feet away from bulldozing Lex into a bloody pulp, he snapped his fingers and a barrier of light and air erected itself in front of him. The Jit was too close to even comprehend slowing down and crashed into the barrier full force. Within the barrier, the earth shattered as if struck by a missile, launching massive clumps of dirt and rocks into the air, yet the barrier itself did not even tremble. The bloody Jit had turned bloody, with its beak caved in, its head disfigured and its body morphed into a ball. Many of its bones were likely broken if not entirely crushed, and Lex did not even want to imagine the condition its spine was in. Yet the anger in the Jit's eyes did not diminish or weaken, and it glared at Lex like the very purpose of its existence was to murder him. A whim struck Lex as he watched the unyielding beast and he asked, "Can you understand me? A beast at your level should have some basic intelligence, right? This is a fight you've already lost. Yield to me, and I'll stop them from killing you." The bloody Jit's aura exploded as it screeched up into the sky, a declaration of its power and hatred. "A pity," Lex said, feeling disappointed. But he no longer paid the bird any heed. Nis, Baron and Tim had entered the barrier as well to deal with it, and he did not doubt their ability to slay it even when the Jit was in good health, let alone now. With his hands in his pockets, Lex began to make his way towards the ruins. He strolled towards the nearest building, ignoring the sounds of combat behind him, and instead he was contemplating his own behavior. It occurred to him that as his cultivation, and along with it his various abilities, grew, his personality was also slowly changing. This was his first outing since the expedition with Ptolemy, and already he could feel the difference. He was no longer wrecked with worry about his survival, and in fact tested the limits of ability and his control over it. Previously, he would have never waited until the bird almost reached the end of the barrier. As soon as it entered, he would have activated it. Now, though, he pushed it to the absolute last minute. Maybe it was arrogance in his newfound power. Maybe it was an inherent confidence in knowing his limits. Maybe it was just him experimenting with something new. All he knew for certain, though, was that it felt good not to be worried about dying at the slightest incident. The calm, confident expression on his face finally broke, letting through a small smile. Now he finally felt like he was living. Now he could finally start actually enjoying all the blessings the inn brought him. He had to be careful not to let his newfound power go to his head, but he could also let himself enjoy it a little. He suddenly recalled a feeling he once got when he first started hosting the midnight games. When the strong and powerful deferred to him, and when he overcame fear to take control of the situation. It was feeling your heartbeat in your chest, it was feeling the blood course through your veins. He took in a deep breath, taking in all the smells of the forest, and as he let the air out of his lungs, he clenched his fists. "Lex freaking Williams," he said in his mind, his smile becoming even bigger. Then he stepped into the first ruins and froze.